Chapter 425. On the 8th day of March, Yushu sect in Jojo Mountain held a tea party for immortals. All the sects in Jojo region came to congratulate them. For a time, the sky above the mountain was covered with spiritual boats, which was spectacular. When it was 7 in the morning, the bell on the top of the mountain rang, and a door was opened in the tactical matrix for protecting the sect. All the spiritual boats entered the peak where the spiritual boats were parked. The spiritual boat of Su family was naturally in the front, just behind that of Zihon sect. At this moment, all the people of Su family gathered on the deck, waiting to land. Su Daiyin came to the deck and glanced at Su Li, who was standing in the crowd and staring at the pavilions below. She couldn't help but smile and walked over with 3 disciples behind her. "What are you thinking about?" A voice sounded behind her. Su Li looked back and saw Su Daiyin. She glanced at the 3 people behind her and shook her head, nothing. Su Daiyin was not annoyed by her obviously perfunctory answer. She called the 3 people behind her to her side and said with a smile, "After the tea party, you will be a member of our second branch. The 3 of them will be your partners in fighting side by side in the future. Take the opportunity to get to know them." Su Li nodded and said, "Su Jojo, from Meng sect." The 3 people who thought there would be more were stunned. That was it. The disciple recruited by the head of the branch is really mediocre. She comes from a small sect and has a narrow vision. Even if she is talented, what can she do in the future? The gentle young man sighed in his heart, but he didn't show any contempt on the surface. He imitated Su Li's tone and held his fist. "Su Xianyun, the first disciple of the second branch. Nice to meet you." The remaining 2 young men looked at each other and smiled. They imitated Su Xianyun and said, "Su Wenbing, the second disciple of the second branch. Su Zheng, the third disciple of the second branch." The attitude of the 3 people was kind, and Su Li didn't show any displeasure. She responded to them with a few words, and they were familiar with each other. During the conversation, the spiritual boat of Su family had landed. After everyone got off the spiritual boat, an elder in charge of logistics put away the spiritual boat and took many servants to the guest peak to settle down in advance. The rest of the people were led to another guest peak hall by the greeting boy of the sect to sit down. Su Daiyin stepped into the hall and glanced around casually. She saw many square tables in the hall, and people of Zihon sect were already resting inside. As for the elders of Yushu sect, she didn't see them. "Seniors of the Su family, please feel free to enjoy some refreshments. Please wait for a moment, everyone will be here soon." The attendant bowed and left the palace. Everyone from the Su family took their seats, occupying 7 or 8 tables. Head Su said with hesitation. "You of hall," Su Xianyun said. "Of Yushu of." The arrangement of Yushu sect was very thoughtful. In the past years, the teams that came to the tea party for immortals, no matter they were from sects or families, had 3 disciples and an elder who led the team. But this time, they temporarily added Su Li, and the team became 5 people. 4 positions were a bit awkward. Sect, and he, and of Di sect of Su sect, Su. Sect, Su sect, and was. And. Of Su of T. Sect, Su sect, and. Su. Of sect. Of. Su of Su. Li sect Su sect of Su. Of Su Li of sect, and. Su Daiyin shook her head and smiled. Every talent was a little arrogant. Su Jojo was too young, and it was normal that she was not calm enough. She should take this opportunity to practice. The sense of belonging needed to be cultivated slowly. On the other side, Su Li casually drank 2 cups of spiritual wine specially made by Yushu sect, and a sense of familiarity surged up. She narrowed her eyes slightly and calculated in her heart, Su Daiyin not only practices fast, but also has the means to train disciples. It is a pity to control such a person's soul. How can I make her work for me? Su Li felt a little embarrassed. At this time, the light suddenly dimmed. Su Li looked up and saw the sunny young man sitting opposite her. Then, another cold young man also sat down expressionlessly. The 2 were obviously enemies, but they acted together. Su Li held her chin and looked at the sunny young man. Su Jojo, what a coincidence. The sunny young man smiled and showed his canine teeth. I have a big deal. Do you want to do it? Su Daiyin frowned when she saw the two people sitting next to Su Li. She was about to get up and have a look, but a sound came into her ears suddenly. Heads of the branches of Su family, please come to the back hall of the hall immediately to discuss the immortal tea plant. Why at this time? Su Daiyin frowned. Seeing that the heads of other branches and the elders of Zihon's sect were ready to leave, she didn't want to delay. She got up and left the hall with everyone. As soon as the elders left, the younger generation immediately chatted much more easily. The hall became lively, and the conversation at the corner table was also drowned in it. Su Li took a sip of the wine unhurriedly and asked with interest, "Why do you find me?" "Because you are powerful." The sunny young man gave a thumbs up and praised without hesitation. Su Li tilted her head and looked at the sunny young man. After a moment of silence, she suddenly asked, "Have you seen me fight?" The sunny young man shook his head. "Then do you know what my strength is?" The sunny young man shook his head again. "Then I don't understand." Su Li laughed. "Maybe my strength is not even comparable to the ordinary people at the peak of Jindan realm. Don't you think it's a loss to talk business with me? This blockhead said that you are hiding your strength." The sunny young man pointed to the stone-faced young man and said with a smile, "Besides, I also think you are a good candidate. It's purely based on my personal feeling." "Oh." Su Li raised her eyebrows. "Business? Tell me about it." Seeing that she was interested, the sunny young man immediately said with great interest, "Do you know the rules of the tea ceremony? We guarantee that you will get a place for tea tasting, and we can even provide you with some cultivation resources in the next few years. In exchange, you will go to a place with us for an adventure a few years later, and we will share the treasures we get. How about it?" "Where?" Su Li didn't answer but asked back. The sunny young man was not annoyed and said with a smile, "Of course it is a good place. There are treasures everywhere. Take the Tsuanjin elixir for example. Not all inherited disciples of Yushu sect can afford it. But in that place, the Tsuanjin elixir is rubbish. It is a waste that no one will pick up if thrown on the ground. There are many magical treasures there. Maybe we will all reach Huashan realm after a trip there." The sunny young man became more and more excited as he spoke. His voice was so loud that other tables could hear him. Some people couldn't help laughing. Puff. He hasn't even reached Yuanying realm. Is he still in Huashan realm? Some people are dreaming during the day, and they are the outstanding cultivators who come to attend the tea party. Tut tut. The sunny young man suddenly turned back and glanced at the young practitioners who laughed at him with a smile. He didn't turn back until those practitioners were scared. He wanted to get close to Su Li as he did to the stern young man last time, but he was blocked by a chopstick, and his nose was almost cut in half. Hiss! The sunny young man shrank back in pain and covered his nose. He said with hatred, "My face. Su Jojo, you have to compensate for my nose. If you don't go with me this time, I won't let you go." The cold eyes of the stern young man flashed. What a sharp pneuma. It seems to be emitted by pneuma. Su Li poured herself the 23rd cup of wine. She picked up the cup and looked at the sunny young man. Her eyes were shining. "Tell me what kind of place the Tiannan Chaos Zone is, and I don't mind going with you." Hearing this, the sunny young man immediately grinned with a proud face. He patted the shoulder of the stern young man and stretched out his other hand. "Blockhead, did you hear that? I won the bet this time. Give it to me." The stern young man frowned and handed out a celestial stone impatiently. Then he stared at Su Jojo and asked seriously, "Why can you hear it?" He must figure out this problem. In addition to cultivation, he also practiced tactical matrices, and, the level was not low, he set up the soundproof matrix casually. Su Yang said it when he came back, but he didn't believe it. So, he tested her this time. Now, he had to believe it. Although Su Yang was unreliable and even had a grudge against him, he wouldn't talk nonsense about the Tiannan Chaos Zone. Su Li sighed. She was a little annoyed. There were many things to do in Yushu sect, and she had no time to waste on this meaningless conversation. The Tiannan Chaos Zone had nothing to do with her. She just wanted to take every step according to the plan. Seeing that Su Li had no interest in talking, the stern young man didn't give up. After hesitating for a moment, he set up another soundproof matrix again, and said in a low tone slowly, "My name is Su Mu. I am not from the Zhou region, but a pawn of the holy sects in the Su family. So is Su Yang." Su Mu's first words made Su Yang lose his smile. His face instantly became gloomy. He gritted his teeth and said, "Are you crazy? How can you say such things?" Su Li was interested. "Go on." Su Yang's eyes flashed, and he was about to take action. But at this moment, he suddenly felt that the surrounding space was squeezed, and he couldn't move or even speak. Coercion? This? What kind of monster did we provoke? Su Yang's pupils were full of fear. He wanted to stop Su Mu, but he could only watch the blockhead continue to speak. The Tiannan Chaos Zone originated from the bloody accident of Holy Spirit. After the reincarnation mirror was broken, the space vibrated, and a passage to an unknown area was opened in the neighboring Dafu region. Except for some dangerous places, almost all the relics in Qingshui Circle had been explored by the predecessors. It was extremely difficult for future generations to harvest them. The sudden opening of the passage was immediately regarded by everyone as a new amazing chance after the reincarnation mirror. In the first wave, half of the practitioners in Yuanying realm and the mighty practitioners in Huashan realm swarmed in. Speaking of this, the cold young man's tone became colder, but on the other side of the passage, it was not a secret realm at all, but a world more powerful than Qingshui Circle. Qingshui Circle sacrificed 3,000 mighty practitioners in Huashan realm and dozens of old monsters in nature's test to barely seal the passage. The price was, all the creatures in the Dafu region were killed, and no one survived. So, the Dafu region became the Tiannan Chaos Zone. Of course, the opposite world also suffered a heavy loss, and many treasures were left in the space of the passage. After the passage was sealed for nearly 800 years, it began to vibrate again, and unstable portals began to appear to tolerate entry. As long as one was lucky enough, he could go in and pick up the treasures, and the road of cultivation would be smooth from then on. Su Yang, that's what you wanted. After saying this in one breath, Su Mu exhaled and said in a relaxed tone, "In exchange, can you tell me why the sound-insulating tactical matrix didn't work?" Su Li rubbed her chin and pondered for a moment. Then she smiled. "The reason is very simple. My realm of tactical matrix is higher than yours. Are you satisfied with this answer?" Su Mu was stunned. He had thought of this, but his realm of tactical matrix had reached the 8th grade, and he was a 9th grade grandmaster on the internet. Su Jojo was younger than him, but she was a 9th grade grandmaster of tactical matrix. Su Mu looked doubtful. Su Li took a sip of wine and said softly, "I don't need to prove anything to you. By the way, which holy sect are you a pawn? Did anyone from that sect enter the reincarnation mirror?" Su Mu was silent for a while, and then he continued, "Tianhe sect in the Tianhe region. The young lord was Fang Yuan, the second on the Tianjiao list." Su Yang's face turned red, and he felt more and more breathless. His pneuma and blood were suppressed to the point of bursting. Hearing Su Mu and Su Li chatting happily, he felt bitterness in his mouth, almost in his heart. This blockhead usually couldn't say a word for a long time. Why did he say everything now? Su Jojo was an old monster. After that, she would definitely kill him. Fang Yuan, Su Li muttered to herself, chuckled, and let go of the suppression on Su Yang. Since he was a pawn of the holy sect where that person was, he was still useful, so she had to keep him. Chapter 426. Take the carrier rune and contact me when Fang Yuan goes to the Tiannan Chaos Zone. Su Li handed over a jade rune made of celestial stone, and Su Mu took it with a blank look. Why did it suddenly involve the young lord? Besides, why did Su Jojo think that he would be obedient? "I want one, too." Su Yang suddenly reached out and looked at Su Li with hope in his eyes. Su Li looked at the well-behaved Su Yang, smiled thoughtfully, and threw out a jade rune. She was not afraid that they would betray her. They were just two pawns who had been exiled by holy sects for a long time and were not valued at all. Even if they took her carrier rune back to report, they couldn't tell the reason, and no one would believe them. Su Mu saw Su Yang got the carrier rune as if he got a treasure, and he was even more confused. Clang, clang, clang. At this time, the big bell of Yushu sect rang 3 times, and then a woman's cold voice passed through the big tactical matrix of the sect and spread to all the reception halls. I'm Fang Ling, the holy girl of Yushu sect. Talents of all sects, please go to the T-Peak to meet. Su Li's eyes flickered. Seeing Su Xianyun and others going out, she also got up and followed them. As soon as she left, Su Yang immediately breathed a sigh of relief, and fear flashed in his eyes. He looked up and saw Su Mu looking at him with a strange face, and said angrily, "What are you looking at? Blockhead. Su Jojo is an old monster. Don't you know that? You actually told her everything. If she hadn't been interested in Fang Yuan, we would have been dead long ago." Su Mu glanced at Su Yang and turned to go out. Su Yang was anxious and followed him, gritting his teeth. "You don't believe me? You've lied to me many times." If Su Jojo is an old monster, why do you take her carrier rune? If I don't take it, it means I'm useless. Who knows if she will kill me? Okay, don't disturb my mood." Su Mu quickened his pace, leaving Su Yang with a bitter face. He muttered to himself, "I only lied to you once, and this time it's true." Su Xianyun and the other 2 slowed down a little when they saw Su Li following them. When Su Li approached, Su Xianyun cupped his fists and said, "I'm really sorry. The 3 of us didn't mean to exclude you. It's just that the rules of this year's tea party are different, and we need to discuss it properly." Su Li shook her head. "It doesn't matter. We practitioners don't need to care about these trivial matters. What's different about this year's tea party? Can senior brother explain? Junior sister, don't worry. That's the best." Su Xianyun breathed a sigh of relief. His master's task was finally completed. However, Su Jojo didn't seem to need a way to ease her mood, as his master said. She really didn't care. This state of mind was hard to come by. Su Xianyun thought and smiled. "As for the rules of the tea party, I heard it from my master. Let's talk about it on the way." "All right." Su Li smiled and walked side by side with the 3 of them. Su Yang, who was not far behind, saw this scene and had goosebumps all over his body. The movement was too natural. If it hadn't been before, he wouldn't have found out Su Li's secret anyway. What did this old monster want to do by sneaking into the tea party? In the past tea parties for immortals, the winning disciples could enter the core of the tea plant and obtain the leaves by chance. Then, they could hand them over to Yushu sect to be processed and obtain the tea leaves. The tea leaves could permanently improve one's comprehension, but not this year. Su Xianyun looked regretful. The former holy girl of Yushu sect went crazy. She ate most of the leaves and drank the spirit of the tea plant. She fought fiercely and directly collapsed the core of the tea plant. So, it's a problem whether we can get the leaves this year. Su Li blinked and didn't speak. Was my Ruahan really crazy? Fighting with the tea plant for no reason seemed to have no other effect except to ruin the tea party for immortals. Su Xianyun was worried, and Su Zheng couldn't help but speak. Master said not to worry. Yushu sect should have kept a lot of tea leaves in storage in the past years, but they couldn't enter the core of the tea plant and obtained the leaves by personal luck. So, the method of determining the quota must have changed. Holy Girl Fang must have something to do with this matter. I think so too. Su Wenbing, who was quite unsociable, answered in a muffled voice. Not long after the 4 of them walked, the tea peak was in sight. They could see the shadow of the green tea plant reflected in the nothingness from a distance. Their sight was distorted, as if they were not in the same world. Tea plant for immortals. Su Li narrowed her eyes. She had also hosted the tea party for immortals. This tree spirit was left by the founding ancestor of Yushu sect. No one knew what agreement it made with the ancestor, and it had always stayed in Yushu sect. It changed its leaves every 500 years, and the replaced leaves could be fried and used for the disciples of Yushu sect to improve their comprehension. Many years later, Yushu sect declined, and the rest of the 25 sects were jealous. After a discussion, they joined forces to force Yushu sect. The head of Yushu sect had no choice but to compromise. So, today's tea party for immortals was held once every 500 years. The law of the jungle was the eternal truth. Su Li's lips curled up. She had walked through the moon-shaped passage between the two peaks and stepped on the tea peak. From afar, she saw a tall woman in a pure white gauze dress standing alone on the high platform of the huge square that could accommodate 100,000 people. Her face was cold. It's really like her. In the square, disciples of all forces gathered. Among the people of Leiyuan sect, Fan Zisang looked up at the high platform and faintly heard a sigh from the jade token on his chest. Fan Zisang's eyes narrowed. Fang Ling was very like the holy girl Su of the last generation. The jade token had been with him for many years. Even if the senior didn't say it, he faintly guessed that this thing had something to do with the bloody accident of Holy Spirit. Even the practice method he secretly practiced was very likely to be from the reincarnation mirror. What kind of person is Su Li? Fan Zisang had always been curious. Every time he thought of this name, he would think of his junior sister apprentice. I don't know how my junior sister apprentice is doing in Ni sect. The Grand Elder of Ni sect should be the mysterious female senior if I am not mistaken. Fan Zisang's thoughts drifted away, and he sat down with the people in the sect in the square. In the seat closest to the high platform, Su Li also sat down and stared at the woman in white on the high platform. Fang Ling sensed the gaze and glanced at Su Li's immature face. She withdrew her gaze without stopping. Facing the people of the 25 sects, she calmly said, "Today, I, Fang Ling, will host the tea party on behalf of Yushu sect. If I am rude, please forgive me. Due to the sealing of the core of the tea plant, the rules of this year's tea party for immortals have been slightly changed after discussion. The selection contest and the quota for entering the core are cancelled. It will be a test. There are 3 levels in the test, and you can get merits in each level. Yushu sect will offer 50 top-grade tea leaves as a reward. Only the top 50 young talents in the 3 tests can get them." Fang Ling's eyes turned cold when she said this. Now, the first level begins. Boom. A giant rune of tactical matrix suddenly appeared on the high platform of the square, and a pillar of light lit up to the sky in everyone's horror. It's a teleportation matrix. It was just a small tea party. Was it necessary to make such a scene? Su Li sensed that the power drawn by the tactical matrix on the ground was accumulating, and she couldn't help thinking. Su Xianyun and others were not so calm. They all looked pale and uneasy. Why didn't the master mention the teleportation matrix to them? Not far away, Su Yang's face changed wildly, and he cursed, "Damn it, how could Yushu sect set up a giant teleportation matrix? I know that nothing good will happen before that place is opened." Fang Ling's face froze when she heard the voice. She wanted to see Su Yang's face through the pillar of light, but her sight was interrupted by a light hum. Her face turned pale. When she was about to look again, the teleportation matrix had been launched. After a violent fluctuation of spiritual power, everyone disappeared. That voice. Fang Ling frowned slightly. Ling, a gentle woman's voice came. Fang Ling immediately flew down from the high platform and saluted, "Master, it's done." "Well." The kind-looking woman smiled, "I think you are a little absent-minded." "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I just think it's too cruel to do this." Fang Ling changed the topic. For some reason, she subconsciously hid the snort. The woman's smile remained unchanged. She looked at the distant cloud-shrouded mountain peak and said faintly, "There is a price to pay for some things. The cause sown in the past and the effect today need to be borne by the 25 sects together." Fang Ling's beautiful eyes showed that she couldn't bear it. They should be the ones to atone for their sins. Why did they send a group of young people less than 1,000 years old to die? You don't have to feel burdened. They are just some fish that escaped the net. The passage is not stable enough, and those whose bone age is over 1,000 can't get in. That is a fair battlefield. They should experience it. Only by walking out of there can they be the real pillars in the future. Otherwise, Qingshui Circle will be in danger. Fang Ling was silent. Fair? Would there be fairness on the battlefield? Well, don't think too much. Go and see your senior sister apprentice. She is going to Luo sect soon. She is not in a good mood these days. Fang Ling saluted and turned into a flowing light, flying to a cave full of cold breath. The two disciples guarding in front of the door saw her and bowed their heads to salute. Holy girl! Holy girl! Fang Ling walked in expressionlessly. The cold breath came to her face. The light in the cave was extremely dark, and the top was covered with icicles, like a blade stabbing on it, reflecting the cold light. Walking along the ice to the deepest part, Fang Ling opened the lapis lazuli gate hundreds of meters thick in front of her with ease and walked in. The temperature dropped again. Even the water vapor exhaled would instantly turn into broken ice and fall to the ground. Fang Ling had to open the protective yuan shield to barely walk to the front of the thick chains. In the chains, a woman with a haggard face and white hair sat stiffly, as if she had been frozen into an ice sculpture, motionless. My Ruahan, I come to see you. Fang Ling's voice trembled. It was hard to tell whether it was because of the ice or heartache. Hearing the name, the ice sculpture-like woman had a slight reaction. She raised her head slightly, revealing a pair of deep-set eyes through her white hair. She didn't speak. Fang Ling took a deep breath, squatted down, and transmitted the sound, Brother Luo is ready. He will save you next month. Hearing this, my Ruahan finally had a little reaction. Her dry lips moved. I won't go. Chapter 427. After a brief sense of weightlessness, Su Li opened her eyes and saw a vast land full of ruins under a cloudy sky. The atmosphere of decay lingered for a long time. No one had been here for at least hundreds of years. But when Su Li sniffed, she could still vaguely smell a trace of blood. Battlefield, Su Li narrowed her eyes and subconsciously thought of the passage to the Tiannan Chaos Zone that Su Mu mentioned. What is this? Su Xianyun, who was not far away, came to his senses and stepped on a brand new jade slip. He couldn't help but reach out curiously. Su Zheng and Su Wenbing immediately came over. Su Li glanced at the three of them and turned her eyes. There were more than a dozen people who stood close to them at that time and were transmitted here. Is this the first test? Su Zheng couldn't help but exclaim in a low voice, which attracted the attention of others. Su Li also came over when she heard the words. Su Xianyun nodded to her and handed over the jade slip. She scanned it with her psychic awareness and saw the contents of the jade slip at a glance. This space is the remains of the battlefield of the righteous path and the evil path. There are still some remnants of the evil practitioners. This is the first test. The space will close in 3 days. At that time, everyone will be squeezed out, and the merits will be determined by the number of enemies killed, and all the magic treasures obtained in this space will belong to the user. The means of the evil practitioners are strange and cunning. Don't take it lightly and lose your life for no reason. The jade slip was densely packed with small words. After the brief explanation, it was some records of the means of the evil practitioners and the proof of killing demons. Su Li glanced at it and kept it in mind. She returned the jade slip to Su Xianyun and pondered. So, this was not Yushu sect. It's really strange that the plan can't keep up with the changes. Su Li pondered for a moment and secretly sent 2 messages. She didn't know if Su Mu and Su Yang could receive them. The merits will be determined by killing. Su Zheng looked at it and said excitedly, killing demons is the duty of our generation of practitioners. This tea party is much more interesting than before. The evil practitioners happened in the ancient times, right? It's said that many of them were left. Are they still alive these days? Su Li turned around and saw some people chatting happily in groups of 3 or 4, as if they were on an outing. She withdrew her gaze and walked alone to a ruined wall. She picked up a piece of rotten cloth that had been pressed under a stone for who knew how many years. A trace of unwillingness and resentment still lingered on it. Spiritual armor made of spiritual silk. It's just yellowed and hasn't decayed. It should be around 500 to 1,000 years old. Is this really the passage that Su Mu mentioned? Su Li's eyes flickered, and speculation emerged in her mind again. Suddenly, a mournful howl, accompanied by the sound of an object rolling down, broke the silence. Su Li suddenly got up and looked back. At the moment when she turned around, in the blink of an eye, the gravel under the ruined wall turned into sharp arrows and shot to Su Li's neck. When the sharp breath was about to cut her throat, Su Li suddenly moved to the left, so that the gravel missed and hit the wall and shattered. Enemy. Su Xianyun and the other two turned their heads and saw a headless corpse falling down. Blood stained the ground that had been silent for a long time. While their attention was attracted, several young practitioners who were alone fell down with blood spurting from their throats. They were about to die. Before Yuanying realm, the physical weakness of practitioners was the same as that of mortals. If they were hit in the vital parts, they would be powerless. Who killed them? Everyone's nerves were tense, and they were vigilant around. Where is Su Jojo? Su Xianyun looked around and suddenly thought of Su Li. He looked in the direction where Su Li had gone before. When he saw Su Li still standing there alive, he couldn't help but feel relieved. He walked over with others and said solemnly, "Junior sister apprentice, this place is very strange. You must follow us closely and don't act alone." Su Li nodded and walked to Su Xianyun without saying anything. Su Zheng wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. But when he saw Su Xianyun's determined look, he didn't say anything in the end. He secretly transmitted the sound, "Senior fellow apprentice, those people died without knowing how they died. We are also in danger. It's not good to take a burden with us. Su Jojo belongs to our second branch. As the first disciple, I should protect her. Don't say such words again in the future." Su Xianyun warned Su Zheng secretly. While being vigilant around, he said in a deep voice, "This place is very strange. We shouldn't stay here for a long time. Let's leave first." "Okay." Su Li responded and followed Su Xianyun. Su Zheng sighed and followed them. Su Wenbing, who was walking at the end, glanced at the 3 traces of crushed gravel on the wall. Confusion flashed in his eyes, but he had no time to think about it. He turned around and quickly followed them. Seeing Su Xianyun and others leaving, the other teams couldn't sit still. Although they didn't know where to go, it was better than staying here and being attacked. Damn it! I knew that those cunning bastards were all up to no good. Su Yang angrily punched the corpse on the ground into pieces. Even if this is not the main battlefield of the Tiannan Chaos Zone, it is definitely not far away. Su Mu's face was cold, but he quickly searched the corpse. Then he stood up and said, "Let's find Su Jojo." Su Yang's eyes brightened and he laughed. "Yes, it is absolutely the safest to stay with that old monster. You don't believe it, do you? Why do you want to find her?" Su Mu glanced at him and went away in a flash. Su Yang was stunned. Looking at the corpse on the ground without any clothes, he suddenly became furious. "My trophies. You blockhead, stop right there." At the same time, in the wilderness where Su Li landed. After everyone left, the space fluctuated a few times. 3 figures emerged. Their thoughts were intertwined and they began to talk. This group of people was unprepared. They are all newcomers of alien clans. I killed 5. Unfortunately, there were too many people, and I didn't have time to collect their treasures. I missed one. I don't know whether it was an accident or the woman hid her strength. Later, his companions came, and I couldn't kill them again. Continue to hunt. After the leading black shadow finished speaking, the 3 figures dimmed again and finally disappeared. Half a day passed in a flash. Su Xianyun led others to search the relics and got a lot of strange things. Just when they felt that the trip was worthwhile, they finally met the first wave of enemies. In the huge gate of the relic, 2 groups of people met at the corner and were all stunned. Then, before Su Xianyun and others could ask questions, they saw the 4 people on the opposite side rushed over without saying a word, and murmured something. Evil practitioners. Su Zheng and his companion were still in a daze, but Su Xianyun reacted quickly. With a stern look, he shouted, "Kill!" In an instant, the 2 sides fought fiercely without any reason. Clang! As soon as the weapons of the 2 sides collided, the huge force passed to Su Xianyun, and he immediately changed his expression. What a great force! Physical practitioners. Su Zheng and others also felt numb in their arms and stepped back. The enemies tested their strength and grinned hideously. Only the practitioner who collided with Su Li was in a daze. The force transmitted from the collision just now was so strong that half of his body was numb. How could the female practitioner I chose be the most powerful among them? The man thought with grievance, and the other three laughed wildly. Their pneuma and blood burst out, and they rushed forward. Second brother, are you soft-hearted by the female practitioner? Ha ha ha. Su Xianyun immediately shouted, retreat. Keep a distance and fight with the flying swords. We are no match for you in close combat. Su Zhang and his companion immediately did so, and Su Li also retreated, which made the opponent confused. Why did you retreat? I am obviously weak in close combat. Su Li glanced at Su Xianyun and others, and there was no danger for the time being. Then, she continued to pretend to fight with the enemy in front of her. Seeing this, the opponent finally knew that Su Li did not intend to expose her strength. While feeling lucky, he became more indignant. Instantly, he stimulated all the pneuma and blood in his body and turned into a bloody figure to attack crazily. Hearing the voice, Su Xianyun couldn't help but worry about Su Li's safety. But he could not separate himself now, and could only hope that Su Li could hold on for a while. The 8 people fought fiercely in the huge ruins, divided into 4 battlefields, and the sand and stones kept flying. While Su Li dealt with the opponent's attack casually, she observed carefully. The way of pneuma and blood eruption seems to be somewhat similar to the pneuma and blood school, but it is more primitive and rough, not as exquisite as the swordsmanship of the school. Where did this group of people come from? Is it possible that the world Su Yang mentioned mainly practiced pneuma and blood? Su Li couldn't help but think. At this time, the opponent persevered in punching her again. She still hit it casually, but this time the opponent failed to block it. With a boom, he shot into the ruins like a cannonball. Su Li was slightly stunned. She didn't use her strength, but the opponent's pneuma and blood declined. There was no such thing as decline in the pneuma and blood school. She floated to the ground and waved away the stones covering the opponent, but she was speechless when she saw that the opponent's pneuma and blood were exhausted and died. The first enemy she met was actually exhausted to death. Ah! Just as she collected the universe ring on the corpse, Su Zheng's scream suddenly came from a distance. Su Li fixed her eyes and flew toward the sound. In the blink of an eye, 3 days passed. In the cold underground cave of the forest, Su Xianyun and his fellows leaned against the mud wall with dirty faces, and all of them were injured. These days, the people they met at the beginning were all well-matched teams, but later they met hundreds of enemy teams, which seemed to be looking for them. The 3 of them were scared out of their wits. They ran away and hid wherever they could. Well, there is still a quarter of an hour left. Su Zheng sat on the tree trunk and waved his hand, which had just been reconnected. He felt relaxed. In these 3 days, they met a lot of teams. In 3 days, they spent half of the time fighting and half of the time fleeing. Even they felt it was a little incredible that they could escape from death every time. First senior fellow apprentice, what kind of hatred do you think those people have against us? Su Zheng transmitted the sound with hatred. He remembered the team he met in the large ruins for the first time. He pierced the enemy's heart with his flying sword, but the man bit off his palm before he died. If Su Xianyun didn't come in time and cut off the man's head, his hand might have been eaten by the man. Su Xianyun covered his chest and coughed slightly. He shook his head. You ask me, but who can I ask? Maybe we will know the answer after we go out. After that, he glanced at Su Li, who sat quietly in the corner, with a strange look in his eyes. Chapter 428. In the past 3 days, there had been no less than 5 battles, and the enemies Su Jojo encountered were the weakest. It would be unreasonable to say that it was a coincidence. Moreover, Su Jojo helped Su Zheng connect his broken palm in the first battle. Her medical skills were inferior to him. Master is really insightful. She can see Su Jojo's extraordinariness at a glance. Su Xianyun thought silently, and turned to look at the water leak on the ground. As time went by, no one wanted to think about anything else. They just wanted to leave this place of trouble as soon as possible. The number of enemies they saw in the past few days was far more than the number of disciples who came to the tea party. It was not a test, but a suicide mission. Seeing that the water in the water leak had reached the bottom, Su Zheng couldn't help whispering, "Soon, soon, drip, drip." Until the last drop of water fell, 3 days were up. At this moment, Su Xianyun and the other two people's hearts stopped beating, looking forward to the arrival of the so-called space exclusion force. But after a long while, time was still flowing, and the cave was still the cave. What they breathed in was still the moist air. Nothing had changed. Su Xianyun's face gradually turned pale, and his body trembled slightly. He took out the jade slip and squeezed it hard until it cracked into 2 halves. How could this be? Su Zheng grabbed the broken jade slip, and his eyes were full of disbelief. Why didn't we go back? Is it because the 3 days are not up yet? Su Wenbing's face was pale, and he murmured, "It's all a lie. We are trapped here. Impossible." Su Zheng's eyes were red. He suddenly stood up and shouted, "How could the master give up on us? We are the 3 most talented people in the second branch. It's absolutely impossible. What a bother." Su Li sighed. She just wanted to do something with the help of the tea party. How could there be so many accidents? At this moment, there was a sudden rush of footsteps outside the cave. The voices of Su Zhang and the other 2 people stopped abruptly, and their eyes slowly turned to the entrance covered by vines. There were hundreds of breaths outside. A team of 100 alien clans. The blood on the faces of Su Xianyun and the other 2 people faded instantly, and the same thought came to their minds. It's over. We are doomed. Su Xianyun trembled and took a deep breath. Get out. Even if I die, I can't die here in vain. Su Li looked at him in surprise. There were not many people who were so stupid these days. Although Su Zheng and Su Wenbin were trembling violently, they forced themselves to straighten up when they heard Su Xianyun's words. They lifted the vines and walked out. When the foreign cultivators saw the 4 of them, they all burst into laughter and said a bunch of things. Although they couldn't understand what they were saying, they were unsurprisingly mocking them. Despair hit them like a tide. Su Xianyun and the other 2 were frozen and confused. The disparity was too great. 1 against 100, how could they escape alive? Su Xianyun took a deep breath. After the panic, he calmed down first. He unsheathed his flying sword and hovered in front of him. With red eyes, he said hoarsely, "Scatter and run." If he couldn't escape, he would kill a few more. Don't let the fiendish cultivators look down on us righteous cultivators. There's no need to run. Su Li, who had been silent for a long time, finally spoke and looked into the distance. What? Su Xianyun was stunned for a moment. Then he saw a commotion at the back of the alien team in front of him. A huge fiery red blade swept through the crowd. In an instant, a dozen people were cut in half at the waist, and their blood spilled. Ha 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 ha. A bunch of weak alien chickens. Look at your Armageddon. Wild laughter came. Su Xianyun heard the familiar whisper and was overjoyed. It's the senior of our Qingshui circle. We are saved. Only practitioners of Yuanying realm could transform their shape into a blade. Don't be happy too early. Su Li poured a basin of cold water on Su Xianyun to calm him down. His eyes fell on Su Li and couldn't move away. Junior sister apprentice Jojo, how do you know there will be a senior of Yuanying realm behind the team to save us? Su Xianyun couldn't help but ask. Before Su Li answered, he heard a furious roar from the alien team. He turned around and saw a 2-meter-tall scarlet practitioner colliding with the fiery red blade, making a loud noise. Blocked. There are also practitioners of Yuanying realm in the alien race. Senior, you can't fight with 2 fists against 4 hands. We are just a drop in the bucket. What should we do? Su Xianyun and others stared at the battle intently and showed a worried look at the same time, but they didn't notice that Su Li suddenly approached the battle. Blockhead, hurry up. I'm going to die. In the crowd, Su Yang cursed at the top of his voice. Surrounded by the fiery red giant blade, he tried his best to resist, but he still couldn't block the attacks from all directions, especially the 2-meter-tall scarlet practitioner who was the main attacker. Every time the mountain-like power hit him, his internal organs would be shaken. Blood had already soaked his clothes and dripped down along the corner of his clothes. As his words left his mouth, the entire ground shook violently. Countless earth spikes emerged from the ground without any warning, instantly penetrating the physical defenses of the foreign race cultivators. In less than a breath of time, 40 to 50 foreign race cultivators were skewered into bloody gourds. Su Yang barely avoided the indiscriminate attack of the thorns underground. He gasped, and his voice was so hoarse that he could hardly speak. "Blockhead, you still want to kill me at this time? Fuck your ancestors." Seeing that the team of 100 people he brought suffered a heavy loss, leaving less than 30 people, the Scarlet Practitioner's eyes were filled with endless anger, and his muscles trembled violently. As the trembling blood-red light faded, a ray of golden light appeared. When this ray of golden light appeared, Su Yang shuddered instinctively, as if he was stared at by an extremely horrible thing. What the hell is that? Su Yang's eyes widened, and he controlled his body to retreat frantically. He felt a fatal crisis. The alien practitioner in this state must not be confronted head-on. Crack! The Scarlet Practitioner stared at Su Yang. Suddenly, with a roar, his huge figure suddenly disappeared from the place. At this moment, Su Yang's heart stopped beating immediately. A huge pressure came from behind, but he couldn't avoid it. "Get away, Arth!" Su Yang roared wildly. His bones burst one after another, and blood gushed out. After paying such a price, he actually turned around in time and put his hands in front of his chest to defend himself. At the same time, Su Mu also appeared from the concealment tactical matrix. He spat out a mouthful of blood and forcibly made a gesture with his hands. In the blink of an eye, a thick ice wall was set up between Su Yang and the Scarlet Practitioner, almost brushing Su Yang's nose and rising into the sky. In the next moment, the scarlet fists with golden light finally arrive. Boom! The huge shock wave set off a gust of wind. The nearby alien practitioners vomited blood and retreated. Su Xianyun and others who were far away were also blown so hard that they couldn't open their eyes. The alien practitioner is so powerful. What happened? Su Xianyun tried to open his eyes, but what he saw made him completely stunned. It was a black gauze fluttering in the wind. Su Jojo. When did she? Crack. Su Yang's arms were twisted, and he flew out like a kite with a broken string. He fiercely smashed into the hard mountain rock and spat out a mouthful of blood. His pupils dilated for a moment before they focused again. He struggled out of the mountain wall with all his might and charged towards the bloody shadow again. Su Mu stared at the Scarlet Practitioner coldly. Ice crystals formed on his solemn face, flashing with cold light. He breathed out cold air, and the water vapor around him condensed into sharp arrows, shooting at the back of the Scarlet Practitioner. However, the arrows only embedded on the surface of the skin and couldn't penetrate deep. Not only the strength increased, but also the defense. Su Mu's cold eyes were full of solemnity. He didn't make any move, but the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped, and the ice spread rapidly from under his feet. In the blink of an eye, several alien practitioners who slowly surrounded him were frozen into ice cubes, which were broken by the wind. The Scarlet Practitioner didn't even look at those unlucky dead guys. His pneuma and blood were boiling as if it was inexhaustible. He broke the ice with one punch. As the ice chips swirled, the bloody shadow flashed. Su Mu's pupils shrank. As soon as he covered his whole body with ice, he felt a sharp pain on his head. He was smashed into the ground like Mount Tai, leaving only half of his body on the ground. Cough, cough, cough. Su Mu's 7 orifices were bleeding, and he was dizzy. The ice could no longer be maintained and all melted. The black shadow raised his fists over his head, and the pressure of death came again. Blockhead. Su Yang was so angry that his eyes almost popped out, but he couldn't save him in time. At this critical moment, a black gauze phantom appeared beside the bloody shadow. At this moment, Su Yang's blood-stained face froze for a moment, and tears suddenly appeared in his eyes. His hoarse shout resounded through the nothingness. "Senior Su, help me." Su Mu looked up in a trance, and saw a scene that he would never forget. A girl in white and black gauze came, without a trace of anger. She stretched out her soft hand, grabbed the back of the bloody shadow, and suddenly threw him backward. The alien practitioner who showed great power let out a scream of horror, and was thrown into the sky lightly like a piece of white paper. Su Li tiptoed lightly, also rose into the nothingness, and stopped beside the bloody red practitioner. The scarlet red practitioner stared at Su Li with a ferocious face. The deep-rooted hatred made Su Li frown slightly. When she was about to ask for more proof, she suddenly sensed that the scarlet red practitioner's body was suddenly in a mess. Her eyes changed slightly, and she kicked the bloody red practitioner to a higher nothingness. Then, the bloody red practitioner, who was as powerful as a god, turned into fireworks and exploded with a boom. Su Mu was even more in a trance. It turned out that the enemy that they couldn't defeat in a bloody battle was so weak. It turned out that what Su Yang said was true. The bloody rain fell one after another, and the alien practitioners were stunned for a moment, but they didn't run away. Instead, they roared desperately and rushed to Su Li, and began to prepare the power of self-explosion in their bodies. Su Li frowned, and quickly controlled a few. But there were still a dozen alien practitioners who succeeded in self-explosion, setting off bursts of shock waves. An indescribable tragedy spread silently from the bloody rain. After sealing the pneuma and blood of several captives in her hands, Su Li reached out and rescued Su Mu from the ground. Su Yang dragged his two drooping arms and limped over. His bones were visible in some places, but he didn't care. He said with a smile, "Senior, our test is completed, right? Our strength may be nothing in front of you, but as long as there is a chance, we will definitely improve our strength as fast as possible, even if we have to go through a mountain of swords or a sea of fire." "What test?" Su Mu wiped the blood off his face, looking blank. Su Yang smiled mysteriously and transmitted the sound in a low voice. "In short, it's a good thing. This space didn't restrict the use of carrier runes." Su Yang wanted to ride on Su Li's coattails, so he had been sending carrier runes to Su Li for 3 days until Su Li said a sentence. "If you want to follow me, you can. Prove your strength first." So, everything was reasonable. Su Li was silent and looked at the sky. After a long time, she stretched out her hand and caught a drop of pale golden blood. She seemed to be talking to herself, or asking, why? She didn't understand what kind of hatred could make them commit suicide without hesitation. The bloody shadow practitioner clearly had a chance to survive. Chapter 429. Wonderful pop-up window free reading. Su Xianyun stared at the blood rain falling from the sky and was speechless for a long time. What on earth did he see just now? Su Zheng touched his face and asked foolishly, "Senior fellow apprentice, am I dreaming?" Su Wenbing suddenly understood. He remembered that Su Li was alone but not injured. The 3 white spots on the wall. It turned out that someone attacked her at that time, but they couldn't hurt her. "Hey, you 3 silly boys over there. Come and clean up the battlefield," Su Yang shouted. Su Xianyun and others immediately came to their senses and hastened their pace to go over. He also recognized that these 2 seniors in Yuanying realm were the 2 who sat with Su Jojo in the guest hall of Yushu sect. Su Jojo. What kind of person did the master invite? Does the master really know the details of this woman? Su Xianyun couldn't help but think, but his mind was in a mess at the moment, and he couldn't think of a reason. It was not advisable to stay here for a long time. The 3 of them cleaned up the battlefield quickly. After collecting all the universe rings, Su Li carried several unconscious practitioners of alien clans and returned to the previous cave. She took out the tactical matrix plate for camouflage and unfolded it. The 10th grade tactical matrix plate. Su Mu took a second look at it. At this moment, he was convinced that Su Li's realm of tactical matrix was higher than his. Snap. In the narrow cave, Su Li left the unconscious alien practitioners and looked at Su Yang and Su Wenbing. She suddenly said without any reason, "Who will explain first?" Su Xianyun and the other 2 sat aside obediently. Looking at Su Li, whose temperament was completely different from before, no one dared to speak first. The stubble of Su Yang's arm bones was still exposed. He bit an elixir in his mouth and was about to apply it on the broken arm bones. Hearing Su Li's question, He smacked his mouth and looked at Su Mu, whose face was full of cracks. He immediately swallowed the elixir and said, "Blockhead, your head is injured. Let me explain first. In fact, it's nothing. This is not Tiannan Chaos Zone, but it's not far from here." Tiannan Chaos Zone? Su Zhang and Su Wenbing were bewildered. Clearly, they had never heard of it. Su Xianyun was shocked when he heard the words. He murmured to himself in a trembling voice, This is the Tiannan Chaos Zone. Isn't it said that there are still a few years before?" Su Yang glanced at him in surprise and said, "Su Daiyin, that old woman, knows a lot." Su Li frowned slightly. Su Yang grinned awkwardly and immediately turned to the topic, "Blockhead, and I have verified a lot of things while rushing to your place these 2 days. Here is probably a small passage produced by the instability of space before the Chaos Zone opens. Powerful people can't come in. But if only people from the Chaos Zone come in, Qingshui Circle will definitely be invaded. So, we are transmitted here to stop those madmen before the passage is officially opened." "Powerful people can't enter?" Su Li thought for a while and asked, "What's the limit of strength?" Su Yang wanted to scratch his head, but when he looked at his hands, he could only smile helplessly and said, "Blockhead, and I thought it was the early stage of Yuanying realm, but now it seems that it is obviously not the case. We don't know the specific limit. The strength that the practitioner with blood shadow broke out was definitely far beyond the early stage of Yuanying realm. Otherwise, with the cooperation of the two of them, they would be able to defeat the practitioner of the same level." Su Li pondered for a moment and said, "What will happen if the strength of the people who come in exceeds the limit?" "The space will collapse." Su Yang spread out his hands. "This space is not stable enough. If it really collapses, I'm afraid that everyone will die in it." Su Xianyun and the other two were shocked. Su Zheng couldn't help but ask, "Then, how do we get out?" Su Yang rolled his eyes and said angrily, "How do I know? People in your Zhozhou region are really ruthless. 1,000 years ago, 90% of the talents in Qingshui Circle were killed. This time, you threw all the young practitioners into this damn place without saying a word. Now I really wonder if all the seniors in your Zhozhou region have rebelled and become the lackeys of the alien clans." Su Xianyun was silent. He just heard a few words from Su Daiyin. On this issue, he had no right to speak at all. As for Su Wenbing and Su Zheng, they had never even heard of the Tiannan Chaos region, let alone talk about it. Su Li glanced at Su Mu, who was still healing his head. Then she looked back at Su Yang and said in a gentle tone, "You can tell me what you think. I have an idea, but with my insignificant strength." Su Yang paused and looked at Su Li with inexplicable hope. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly, and her clear pupils seemed to reflect a clear spring. She knocked on the stone beside her hand and said, "If you want to go out alive, don't think about so many crooked ideas." "Ahem." Su Yang coughed and didn't feel embarrassed. He continued, "Although Blockhead and I have been dormant in the Su family for many years, we are still from the holy sects and have a vision. This space is unstable, but it doesn't mean that there is no exit. Moreover, the exit must be set in the most stable place of the space. According to the law of the small mysterious realm collapsing from the outside, the exit of this space must be in the center of the mysterious realm," Su Yang said. He didn't care that Su Xianyun and the other two's expressions changed. He gestured with his drooping arm, "So, only those with great strength can constantly break the surface to test the strength of the space and the trend of the stability of the space. Then we can find the exit in the middle and go out from here." After Su Yang finished his words, Su Xianyun and the other two looked at Su Li at the same time. Even Su Mu opened his eyes and looked at her with hope in his eyes. No one wanted to die here in vain, and so did he. Su Li supported half of her cheek with her hand, and her eyes fell on several alien practitioners on the ground. She was silent. The more Su Yang explained, the more doubts she had in her heart. The hatred of alien practitioners originated from the battle between the two realms. But why did every alien practitioner face death with equanimity? This was the biggest doubt. Secondly, the pawns from the Zhozhou region were no more than 1,000 in Jindan realm. For the alien practitioners in the entire space, they were no different than delivering food to them. What could they do to stop the alien practitioners? Even Su Yang knew how to find the exit. Those alien practitioners were not all fools. How could they not go? Finally, there was the biggest doubt. Su Li suddenly raised her head and stared at Su Yang, which made the latter's heart shrink. Before he could speak, Su Li asked coldly, "Why do you want to follow me? If you can't explain it clearly, just stay here." Su Yang was stunned, and the smile on his face slowly disappeared. At this moment, without warning, Su Mu suddenly knocked out Su Xianyun and the other two, and said in a deep voice, "Let me tell you." Su Li's eyes flashed, and she nodded gently. After a long while, Su Li looked at Su Yang, whose eyes were red, and Su Mu, who was still expressionless. She shook her head and sighed, "I'm not a garbage collector here." Hearing this, Su Yang tried his best to restrain his expression, but he couldn't hide the disappointment in his eyes. Whoosh! Su Li got up and put away the matrix plate. She walked to the exit of the cave and stopped, saying, "What are you doing?" "Huh!" Su Yang raised his head in astonishment. When he looked up, he saw the girl turned around and showed a rare smile. "However, the strength of you two is not too bad." Senior, Su Yang pursed his lips and couldn't hide the excitement in his eyes. When he was about to say something, he saw Su Mu suddenly stood up and saluted respectfully. He raised his head and said resolutely, "I believe in my intuition. As long as you don't mind, I will follow you until death." "Blockhead, when did you learn to be glib?" Su Yang widened his eyes and stood up angrily. He turned to look at Su Li and showed a big smile. "Senior, I am different from Su Mutu. In the future, if you ask me to go east, I will never go west. Even if I betray the holy sects, I will do it in a minute." Su Li glanced at Su Yang and didn't say anything. She stretched out her hand and released Hei. In the blink of an eye, Su Xianyun and the other two fainted people were swallowed into her stomach. Su Yang and Su Mu only saw a black shadow flash by, and then Su Xianyun and the other two people disappeared. They couldn't help but be confused. What was that just now? Don't appear in front of Su Xianyun and others in the future. I will erase their memories. Su Daiyin is a good seedling, and I don't want to let her go. After it is done, you can wait. Putting away Hei, Su Li gave a faint warning and turned to go out. Su Yang and Su Mu looked at each other and the ground. After thinking for a while, they followed her at the same time. No one killed the unconscious alien practitioners. With Su Li's meticulous thinking, it was impossible for her to forget to kill them. The only explanation was that she didn't want to kill them. Su Li walked out of the catacombs and saw the two limping up. She couldn't help but frown. She ran the Ghost Valley meditation direction instantly and transformed 10% of the genuine energy in her body into 2 balls of green light and threw them to the two. In this life, she didn't practice the Ghost Valley meditation direction. But with the high level of Sueyu tactics, she could transform all kinds of holy methods. The Ghost Valley meditation direction was just a top holy method, and she could transform it easily. As soon as Su Yang and Su Mu came out of the catacombs, they saw a ball of green light rapidly enlarging in front of them. Both of them were nervous. They were seriously injured, and it was too late for them to avoid it. They could only accept the green light. The moment the green light was integrated into their bodies, it immediately turned into a majestic vitality and permeated into every piece of flesh and blood in their bodies. The broken bones made a cracking sound, and the flesh and blood grew at a speed visible to the naked eye. Su Yang had never enjoyed such treatment, and he almost cried out in comfort. The cracks on Su Mu's face and head were also repaired quickly as if time went back. In a short time, except for the bloodstains on their bodies, there were no more wounds. Su Yang raised his hands and squeezed them hard. After the comfort, he was full of disbelief. How could there be such a healing method in this world? If I had known it, I wouldn't have taken the Tianbao elixir. That elixir is worth 100,000 upper-grade spiritual stones, which is enough for me to practice for a long time. Su Yang was so distressed. He didn't know whether Su Li would press him to the ground and rub him hard if she knew his first thought. Chapter 430. The Poisonous Wife. Chapter 430, Kai Mo Realm. Currently typing. Please wait a moment. After the content has been updated, please refresh the page to receive the latest update. Chapter 431. 34 Chinese Language Net. This is a wonderful free reading without a pop-up window. Senior, the healing speed in the north of the space is faster. Su Yang had been staring at the broken hole and carefully observed it. After several confirmations, he said seriously. Su Li opened her eyes and put away the pocket-sized cave in her palm. But she didn't move for a long time. Instead, she looked to the north. Su Yang and Bai Mu were slightly confused, but soon their faces changed. A bloody flowing light flew quickly from the northern sky and stopped not far away in the blink of an eye. After the flowing light dissipated, a cold young man with a pale face showed up. He looked at Su Li and the other two coldly through the broken hole. Su Yang subconsciously glanced at Su Mu and sensed the same cold pneuma. He couldn't help but pout his mouth at the young man and transmitted the sound, "Blockhead, when did you have a twin brother?" Su Mu turned his head and ignored him. The atmosphere was silent for a long time. The cold young man finally couldn't help speaking the language of Qingshui Circle fluently. "People of Qingshui Circle, you have crossed the boundary." Su Yang and Bai Mu were shocked. Didn't they say that there was no communication between the two circles? How could this person speak the language of Qingshui Circle? Su Li didn't seem to be surprised. Her soft eyes flashed and she asked softly with a smile, "Then tell me, what is crossing the boundary?" Hearing this, Bai Chen's killing intention flashed in his eyes. He said coldly, "The two circles have an agreement before. Since you have crossed the boundary," before he finished his words, the long sword in his hand turned into a golden light. In the blink of an eye, it crossed a distance of dozens of feet and slashed at Su Li's head. "Go to hell!" The golden light broke out, and the killing intention was awe-inspiring. The shrinking hole was immediately affected and had a tendency to expand. The heavy pressure emitted by the golden light immediately reminded Su Yang and Bai Mu of the martial practitioner with the blood shadow. Their faces changed and they retreated quickly. They were worried at the same time. The golden light was too strong. This person was much more powerful than the martial practitioner with the blood shadow. Could Su Jojo deal with him? Ding! A crisp sound of the sword resounded between heaven and earth. Su Li and Bai Chen separated as soon as they touched each other. Both of them couldn't control their bodies and stepped back a few steps. Gently shaking her numb arm, Su Li was astonished. This was the first time someone was on par with him in terms of strength. The descendant of the Blood Qi school really lived up to his reputation. Su Li was just surprised, but Bai Chen was completely shocked. Could the people of Qingshui Circle cultivate such a physical body? "You want to kill me?" Su Li suddenly said in a flat tone, but Bai Chenshin couldn't help but feel cold. This woman, whoosh. Before he could react, the space rippled, and Su Li's figure disappeared instantly. This is bad. Bai Chen's pupils constricted, and he retreated again and again in shock. But the flying sword wrapped in black light cut through the void all the way and shot toward him from behind without warning. A cold voice echoed in his ears. "Those who want me dead, I will not let a single one of them go." Su Yang grabbed Su Mu's arm excitedly, and his eyes were shining. "Blockhead, we've really found someone to rely on. That sword didn't use any sword moves, but it's definitely not weaker than any late-stage nascent soul cultivator." Su Mu helplessly tried to push Su Yang's hand away, but he failed. He could only let Su Yang do as he wished, and a trace of warmth appeared in his cold eyes. Perhaps he chose the right path. The cold sharpness almost pierced into his heart, and he was doomed to die. Bai Chen's eyes dimmed instantly. "Master, Your Excellency, please show mercy." But at this moment, a strange and urgent voice sounded. An unknown force suddenly penetrated the void and hit Su Li's sword. The sword deviated and stabbed into Bai Chen's viscera obliquely, but it didn't hurt his heart. Su Li's eyes were cold, and her palms instantly made several gestures like butterflies flying through flowers, which fell into the flying sword. The flying sword trembled violently, passed through Bai Chen's body, and blasted a fist-sized hole, and then stabbed into the shattered void with indomitable will. AO sword skills. The first move, collapse. Su Yang was dazzled and frightened. Does Su Jojo finally show her true colors? What kind of sword skill is that? The gestures are so complicated. Tut. He scratched his head and felt ashamed of his lack of knowledge for the first time. It was not so easy to find out Su Jojo's origin. Retreat. Su Mu, who had been silent, suddenly said. He picked up Su Yang and ran away. Then a deafening roar resounded through the world. Boom. A big hole as high as the sky was blasted out in the dark and chaotic void in an instant. The gloomy sky cracks spread rapidly. The burly middle-aged man who rushed over changed his expression dramatically and shouted sternly, "Your Excellency, stop. Do you want all the practitioners of Qingshui Circle in this circle to die?" Su Li was expressionless and continued to draw her sword. So be it. What does it have to do with me? You, a 7th grade practitioner, entered the passage. Does Qingshui Circle want to unilaterally tear up the agreement? Su Li was indifferent, as if she didn't hear it at all. The middle-aged man was furious. Seeing the crack in the sky getting bigger and bigger, he was extremely aggrieved, but he had to soften his tone. "Your Excellency, please calm down. Bai Chen didn't mean to be your enemy. If you want to know why he crossed the boundary, I will tell you." As soon as he finished speaking, Su Li's movements stopped. She withdrew her sword in the blink of an eye and stood there calmly, as if nothing had happened. Then, the middle-aged man saw Su Li's cold face suddenly soften. She smiled and cupped her hands. "Thank you very much." Not only did the middle-aged man not react to Su Li's sudden change, but Su Yang and Su Li were also stunned. The burly middle-aged man stared blankly at the harmless girl with a smile, standing in the broken void unscathed. His heart, which had been calm for many years, was a little cold. A moment later, Su Li and the other two followed the burly middle-aged man into the camp. Practitioners in the camp saw the bloody and dizzy Bai Chen in the hands of the burly middle-aged man and surrounded them. Many people looked at Su Li and the other two with hatred in their eyes, as if they wanted to devour them. "What are you doing? Hurry up and bring him down to treat his injuries." The burly middle-aged man glared and scolded harshly. He drove the crowd away for fear that Su Li would be unhappy again and a big fight would break out. The practitioners glanced at Su Li with hatred. Due to the majesty of the burly middle-aged man, they obediently left with Bai Chen in their arms. In the main tent, Su Li and the burly middle-aged man sat opposite each other. Su Yang and Su Mu sat next to each other with a slightly tense look. Not everyone could be as calm as Su Li when she went deep into the enemy's camp. They didn't have the confidence. "Bai Chen is not my disciple." The burly middle-aged man took a deep breath and stared at Su Li, saying in a deep voice, "His master died in the hands of people of Qingshui Circle. You and I are mortal enemies. I don't expect you to understand what I said. I just hope you can calm down. Once this circle is broken, it is not a good thing for both of us. You should know." "I don't know." Su Li interrupted him with a gentle smile, but it made the burly middle-aged man feel cold. "So, what is the so-called crossing the boundary?" "You don't know?" The burly middle-aged man stared at her and raised his voice. "It's impossible. Nothing is impossible." Su Li played with the flying sword in her hand and said quietly, "Most of the holy sects in Qingshui Circle have irreconcilable hatred with me. Do you think they will reveal the secret to me?" The burly middle-aged man's expression changed. Although he didn't speak, he couldn't hide his doubts. Being enemies with most of the holy sects? How could you say that? Even Su Yang and Su Mu felt that Su Li was tricking them, so they didn't feel anything. Su Li smiled helplessly and said casually, "Well, it seems that it's useless for me to talk nicely. The huge vortex outside the camp. If I destroy it, will this circle be completely destroyed?" As soon as she said that, the burly middle-aged man's expression suddenly changed. He took a deep breath and said slowly, "Don't be impatient, Your Excellency. For people at our level, the agreement between the two circles is not a secret. I will tell you. 1,000 years ago, when the passage between the two circles was opened, our Qimo Circle and your Qingshui Circle fought for 100 years. After countless strong men died, we finally chose to stop the war. At that time, the two sides had fought fiercely and couldn't stop at all. Therefore, the high-level officials of both sides came up with a plan to stop the war. They agreed to recuperate and fight again after 1,000 years. Now, it is less than 5 years before the battlefield opens again. Su Li listened quietly and didn't mean to speak. Su Yang couldn't hold back and asked, "What's the explanation of this small world?" The burly middle-aged man's eyes became cold. He was friendly to Su Li only because of her threat. Who was Su Yang? However, he was not sure whether Su Yang asked the question on behalf of Su Li. He could only suppress his anger and asked back, "Don't you people of Qingshui Circle know where the passage comes from?" "Bloody accident of Holy Spirit," Su Mu suddenly said with surprise and doubt in his eyes. The burly middle-aged man sneered, "Yes, it seems that you have guessed it. The condition for opening the passage is not the so-called space oscillation, but flesh and blood. The flesh and blood of living creatures. No one knows the reason, but the high-level officials of our circle have done experiments. Only flesh and blood can maintain the stability of the passage. So, we need people to come in constantly to die, so that we can survive for 5 years. What? Su Yang's mind was shocked, and his face was extremely ugly. Even if he really spoke ill of holy sects before and even threatened to betray them, there was still a trace of fantasy deep in his heart. That was the only place where he had a sense of belonging. But now, Su Yang rubbed his face fiercely. He opened his mouth and wanted to speak, but he had nothing to say. Su Mu's face was stiff. Ever since his sister died, he had given up. Now that he heard what the Glory sect had done, he was not sad at all. Instead, he felt relieved. He thought to himself, "Maybe I don't owe them anything." The burly middle-aged man squinted at the two and seemed to enjoy their expressions. He said, "Do you know what's the biggest difference between Qingshui Circle and Qimo Circle?" Before Su Li answered, he continued with a smile, "Over there, the high-level officials of Qimo Circle are frank enough. All the men know the ending, but they die generously. And you are just a group of poor wretches who are deceived before death." Hearing this, Su Li finally smiled. Chapter 432. Looking at the smile on Su Li's face, the burly middle-aged man was shocked. When he said these words, he had thought that Su Li's reaction might be anger, gloomy, or even expressionless. But he didn't expect that she would smile so happily. It didn't seem to be fake at all. "Your Excellency, what are you laughing at?" He snorted tentatively. "Do you think I'm lying to you?" "On the contrary." Su Li stopped smiling and said indifferently, "I agree with you very much. If one day your Qimo Circle can really attack Qingshui Circle and destroy holy sects, it may not be a bad thing." The burly middle-aged man was at a loss and didn't know what to say. Even the senior officials of Qimo Circle still had a lot of hesitation about attacking Qingshui Circle. But now a practitioner from Qingshui Circle actually believed them. Did he become muddle-headed after practicing too much? Or the world changed so fast that he couldn't understand it? So in order to save flesh and blood consumption, your two circles agreed that no one could break the space? Yes. Then why are you guarding the exit of the passage? There are 6 exits, and this is one of them. Each of our 2 circles will guard 3 exits and no one will leave. What about me? Of course you can. If you continue to stay here and destroy the space, I will also be very troubled. Su Yang almost couldn't hold back his laughter as he watched the two of them exchange questions and answers. "Blockhead, look at this alien big shot. He has been fooled by Su Jojo. The people of Mo Circle are too gullible, aren't they? It's Qimo Circle." Su Mu corrected him sullenly and wondered why Su Yang was so sure that Su Jojo was a liar. He didn't think that if it was true, what should he do? If they were enemies with the entire Qingshui Circle, Qimo Circle wouldn't treat them as friends. Maybe Su Jojo could survive in that desperate situation, but he and Su Yang would definitely die without leaving any remains. An hour later, the burly middle-aged man said to Su Li with a serious face, "My name is Han Ju, a warrior of the 7th level, which is equivalent to the practitioner of Huishan realm in your Qingshui Circle. As you said, There is no right or wrong in the dispute between the two circles, only victory or defeat. Although you are an enemy of the alien race, I want to make friends with you. May I know your name? Su Li looked at Han Ju and smiled slightly. She opened her red lips slightly. My surname is Su Jojo. Maybe I will also be called Su Qingshui in the future. Han Ju heard the hidden meaning in her words, but he didn't understand it. He didn't struggle with it. He got 2 cups, picked up one of them and said with a smile, Su Jojo, you're my friend. If we meet on the battlefield in the future, I won't hold back. I might not come to the battlefield. Su Li also picked up the wine cup, took a sip, and chuckled. Was it really so delicious? He had eaten secular food before, but compared with spiritual wine and delicacies, it was hard to swallow. It was even worse than pig's feed. Even the pigs raised in the sect ate much better than the mortals in the secular world. But seeing Su Li eat happily, he couldn't help but waver at this moment. He couldn't help but pick up a piece of spiced beef with chopsticks and put it into his mouth. Then, a special stench of secular meat filled his mouth and nose. You! Bah! Su Yang bent over and spat out everything. He immediately took out a few detoxifying Kingsinden from the universe ring and put them into his mouth. Su Mu didn't move his chopsticks all the time. At this moment, seeing Su Yang's face was flushed, he raised his eyebrows and said lightly, why bother? Su Yang didn't know if he misheard, but there was a hint of gloating in his plain words. Su Yang touched his tongue and said with a bitter face, it's so bad. Senior, why do you still eat it? Su Li glanced at him, picked up a piece of beef and ate it. She nodded with relish and said, it tastes good. Don't eat it if you don't want to. It's a waste. Su Yang looked at Su Mu with dissatisfaction, but Su Mu closed his eyes and refused to taste the beef slices no matter what. He didn't believe it and picked up a second piece. You! Su Mu listened to Su Yang's complaints and felt the warm light coming in from the window. His lips, which were as flat as a knife's edge, slightly curved up. This feeling was very good. Did Su Jojo often come to the secular city to relax? He turned his head and saw Su Li's side face, but he was stunned. If he didn't see it wrong, he actually saw envy in her eyes. Envy of what? Su Mu looked over and saw a family of 3 standing in front of a vegetable stall with a satisfied smile on their faces. He couldn't understand. What was there to envy about the life of the weak? Let's go. Su Li suddenly got up and dropped a golden leaf. She disappeared in the blink of an eye. Su Mu didn't dare to neglect and immediately disappeared with Su Yang, who was still retching. What's that? Under the vegetable stall, the farmer's wife suddenly felt something in her hand. She couldn't help but spread it out and saw 3 silver leaves. She was overjoyed and quickly put them away after looking around. God bless her, she could have a good new year this year. During the flight of the spirit boat, Su Mu was still absent-minded. Su Li didn't hide her action of giving the silver leaves from them. A practitioner whose cultivation was comparable to that of Yuanying realm still had compassion for ordinary mortals. What was this? Su Jojo, whom they followed, was actually a kind-hearted and innocent girl. I want to sneak into Yushu sect again. What can you do? The sudden sound transmission interrupted Su Mu's wild imagination. Yushu sect. Su Yang couldn't help but scratch his head and said, Senior, with your strength, you will definitely be treated well if you go to Yushu sect openly. Why do you sneak in? Su Li glanced at Su Yang lightly, and the latter immediately shrank his neck and stopped talking. The territory of Yushu sect covers the entire Jojo mountain range. Su Mu said at this time, it's very easy to enter Jojo mountain range. You just need to open an entrance at the weak part of the big tactical matrix for protecting the sect. Senior, if you want us to give advice, you need a specific direction. Su Li took a deep look at him and slowly said 3 words, T-Peak. Sure enough. Su Mu breathed a sigh of relief. He had been speculating about Su Jojo's purpose of sneaking into the tea party. How could Su Jojo be interested in a few tea leaves as a reward with her strength? The only possibility was the immortal tea plant itself. Senior, Do you want to steal the immortal tea plant? Before Su Yang's voice died away, he flew into the sky with a whoosh and stuck to the surface of the shield of the spirit boat. He couldn't get down and grimaced. Su Mu glanced at him with pity. Looking at Su Li, who just withdrew her hand, he frowned and analyzed. The immortal tea plant has become a plant spirit, and its wisdom is no lower than that of any practitioner. Plant spirits are inherently weak. Its strength may be weak, but it has lived for a long time. It has been at least 7,000 years since the founding of Yushu sect, and its cultivation is probably no worse than that of the peak of Yuanying realm. Senior, if you want to steal the tea plant without anyone knowing, I'm afraid. I know what you said. Su Li looked at the outline of the Jojo mountain range that faintly emerged in the nothingness in the distance. The big tactical matrix for protecting the sect of Yushu sect is not as simple as you think. If I really open a hole on it, it will be noticed immediately. Su Mu's expression changed slightly. Holy tactical matrix? Yes. Su Li nodded without surprise. You have also stayed in a holy sect. The strength of the founder of Yushu sect in those days was no less than that of any grand elder of a holy sect. If it weren't for his disappearance. Well, let's not talk about the past. Tell me what you think. Su Mu's thoughts were a little confused for a moment. Senior. Su Yang's eyes suddenly brightened on the shield of the spirit boat. I know how to get in. Chapter 433. Yangyang Town. Su Yang stood by the cold lake and looked a little embarrassed. Su Li looked at the sparkling water and said faintly, "Is this the opportunity you mentioned?" Su Yang smiled embarrassedly. Senior, as you can see, there is no one on the streets of Yangyang Town. It is said that there are water monsters eating people. Yushu sect did send Pang Hua, an inherited disciple, to investigate. I also inquired about Pang Hua with the identity of a hidden disciple of Su family. He will definitely come these days. We have been here for 2 days. Su Mu stood aside and didn't forget to stab Su Yang in the heart. He didn't dare to look into Su Li's eyes. Suddenly, a gust of wind rose and Su Li disappeared in the blink of an eye. Su Yang reacted quickly and turned around. He saw a figure suddenly appear in the middle of the lake. It was Pang Hua. It turns out to be in the lake. No wonder I didn't find it. Su Yang suddenly realized. Pang Hua heard this and saw a shadow falling from the sky before he could take a breath. Then he didn't know anything. On the shore, after a short while, Su Yang and Su Mu watched Su Li withdraw the silk thread from her fingertips, and their faces changed. After Su Li removed her hand, Pang Hua opened his eyes blankly. When he turned around and saw Su Li, he immediately got up and saluted hurriedly. Master. Su Yang's scalp was numb and Su Mu's eyelids were twitching. Pang Hua was at the peak of Jindan realm, but he was controlled by Su Jojo in such a short time. Call me Mr. Su Li looked at Pang Hua with the same fanaticism as Su Yuanhai in her eyes. She said calmly, "What did you find under the water?" "Mister, there is indeed a water monster." Pang Hua took out the mountain-like body of the water monster from the storage room without hesitation and threw it on the ground. He said doubtfully, "However, this water monster was originally the most common otter in the water. I don't know how it grew to such a big size." "Wow, it's so big." Su Yang was amazed and touched the hard skin of the giant otter. The skin can be made into the lowest grade of spiritual armor. When Su Li saw the otter's corpse, her eyes changed instantly. She immediately jumped to the otter's head, pinched a spell to urge the flying sword to stab in. In a moment, a fragment with a transparent luster was brought out by the flying sword. "What is this?" Su Yang and Su Mu looked at each other and didn't recognize the fragments on Su Li's flying sword. Su Li looked solemn and felt the vibration of the mirror ring on her waist. She narrowed her eyes slightly and pretended to wipe the storage room. She whispered in her heart, "Black Lotus, put it away." Black Lotus Ring also knew that the occasion was not appropriate, so it quietly appeared and collected the fragments. It was rare that it was not verbose. Once the fragment was put away, the mirror ring immediately stopped shaking. The transparent little beast crawled in the space at the edge of the mirror ring with a dignified expression. Could it be That I've been discovered? But if she was discovered, why didn't Su Li react at all? That shouldn't be the case. It had clearly killed her in her previous life, sir? After seeing Su Li's series of movements, Pang Hua stood on the otter's head in a daze and couldn't help but speak out. Su Li immediately came to her senses, and a faint smile appeared on her face. Well done. I have found the reason. It did eat something it shouldn't have. That's it. Let's go back to the sect. Seeing Su Li's smile, Pang Hua was immediately flattered and nodded. As for the two of you. Su Li turned her head to look at Su Yang and Su Mu, who were absent-minded. The latter both took 2 steps back subconsciously. When they came to their senses, their faces were very stiff. Don't be nervous. Su Li glanced at Su Mu, and her eyes finally fell on the face of Su Yang, who had a hollow smile on his face. As long as I want, I can do that at any time, but it's not necessary. Su Yang, don't forget why you turned to me. Su Yang took a deep breath and said with a sad face, Senior, I know, but I have harmed people. Can he be saved? Su Mu glanced at him in surprise. In his memory, Su Yang was not so kind. Su Li took a deep look at Su Yang and didn't answer him. She ordered softly, you were sent to the Chaos Zone. Most of your identities have been suspected by the Su family. It's not suitable for you to return to the head branch for the time being. Go to Su Yuan Hai. He is my man. When you find out that someone has returned, you can go back to the head branch to test him. Understand? Hearing this, Su Yang breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. He quickly patted his chest and said loudly, Don't worry, Senior. I am much smarter than Blockhead. Even if he is dead, I will not die, nor will I betray you. Su Mu turned his head away and didn't want to talk to him. Pang Hua, let's go. Su Li didn't say anything more. In the blink of an eye, she and Pang Hua turned into flowing light and disappeared into the sky. Su Yang kept a bright smile on his face. Until Su Li disappeared from his sight, he gasped and sat on the ground awkwardly with a face full of lingering fear. Oh my God, I'm so scared. What kind of soul-luring skill is that? After Pang Huazhong's operation, he seemed to want to die for Su Jojo. Do you think we are also bewitched by him? Pang Mu won't call Su Jojo's name directly. Su Mu didn't forget to add insult to injury. Su Yang rubbed his face hard, and finally looked a little serious. I feel that something is wrong. How can she be at ease with us leaving? Isn't she afraid that we will directly escape to the end of the world and never return to Jojo region? I will go to the 7th branch of the Su family. Su Mu glanced at Su Yang coldly. If you want to leave, do as you please. I %% hash yuan. Su Yang's face collapsed. All the roots suddenly paused, and a slightly gloomy and old voice sounded in Su Li's ears. Little girl, who told you my name? Senior, you said it yourself. The ethereal voice approached, and the outline was revealed. The human face on the core stared at it carefully, looked it up and down, and thought it was only unfamiliar. Junior, I have lived for a long time, but I am not so old that my memory is muddled. How dare you lie to me? The voice of the tea tree was angry, but it did not stop Su Li from approaching. In the blink of an eye, Su Li stood in front of the core of the tea tree. She took off her cloak, and let all the roots pointed at her vital parts like sharp swords. She smiled sweetly. Senior, do you still remember that I have an agreement with someone? If I come back one day, I will set you free. Bijue's face changed instantly. You are that. Su Li, you are still alive. Impossible. I died, and then I came back to life. Su Li spoke frankly. Bizhui looked at Su Li's face in surprise and doubt. After a long time, he laughed out loud. Yushu sect is really interesting. After so many years, they still send you, a little girl in Juji realm, to test me. Do you really think that I dare not kill people because I am bound by the tactical matrix? Senior Bizhui, don't be angry, and there is no need to test me. If people of Yushu sect find me, it will do no good to either of us. Su Li still looked calm. Today, I will set you free, but I am not talented, and I want to make an agreement with you. The old face was no longer angry. He smiled and said slowly, then tell me. No one can come here for a long time, so I will listen. Whoosh. Without saying anything, Su Li turned over her palm, and the flying sword appeared. She cut the palm of her left hand, and the red blood dripped along the lines on a root. Only one drop fell, and the huge and complicated runes of the tactical matrix appeared silently and automatically. They wrapped around the core of the tea tree like earthworms. Then, Bizhui saw that the red blood turned black, and instantly integrated into the runes of the tactical matrix, turning into an inconspicuous black spot. This. There is a flaw in the dragon-trapping tactical matrix. Bizhui sensed the change of the roots, and was shocked. He stared at Su Li, and countless roots trembled. His huge eyes showed a humanized fear, and he said incoherently and tremblingly, "Your blood. What did you get?" "Su Li, the daughter of luck. It is really you." Chapter 434. Daughter of Luck. What is that? Su Li stared at Bizhui with her clear eyes. She heard Daughter of Luck from Su Yuanhai, and now he heard Daughter of Luck. The two names were similar and probably had the same meaning. But what did it mean? Su Yuanhai didn't know, and she could only keep her doubts in her heart at that time. But now, Senior Bizhui? Whoosh. The roots of the tree shook, and the expression on Bizhui's face disappeared instantly. He said with a smile, "There is nothing special about the so-called Daughter of Luck. You have strong luck, and you can bring good luck to everything you do. This is also a rare constitution." Su Li nodded gently, and a light flashed in her eyes. She didn't ask anymore. Bizhui didn't tell the truth. The constitution was the constitution, and it could only belong to her. Even if it was rare, could it make people crazy enough to cut her flesh and eat her alive? Obviously not. "Senior, can we talk about the deal now?" Su Li turned back to the original topic, and the old eyes on the core of the tea plant immediately brightened. "What do you want?" "I want to be the master of Jojo region." Su Li showed a formidable smile. "I won't let go of anyone who forced me in the previous life, and such people are the majority in Yushu sect. I need your help." "The master of Jojo region?" Bizhui stared at her slightly, and said with a little more contempt, "Junior, are you kidding? If I melt this tactical matrix, will you still think I am kidding?" Su Li said with a smile on her calm face, "My deal with you is very simple. After I set you free, you will help me at the critical moment to block the Grand Elder of Yushu sect for 20 breaths. After that, you can leave by yourself no matter whether I succeed or not. The world is big, and you are free to go." Bizhui's face disappeared into the core. He admitted that he was tempted. After being imprisoned for 7,000 years, he longed for freedom more than anyone else. But Su Li's request was too loose. It was so loose that he couldn't believe it. "Junior." After a long time, Bizhui's face reappeared on the core, and it was clearer. He stared at Su Li's still immature face, and asked coldly, "Why should I believe that you will help me instead of falling into another trap? After you melt this tactical matrix, aren't you afraid that I will run away immediately, regardless of the agreement?" "I'm scared." Su Li raised her head and smiled confidently, "But I believe that you won't offend a girl with a promising future just to avoid this little favor." Bizhui's expression changed. He couldn't figure out whether Su Li really didn't understand or she was testing. "Niece of Destiny has a bright future." There was nothing wrong with saying that, but which of the daughters of Providence had a good end? Old Mo Shu of Yushu sect has not appeared for 2,000 years. He is probably dead. This Spirit Void Jr. is only at the late stage of soul formation. When my seal is undone, it will definitely be easy for me to stop him for 20 breaths of time. The more Bizhui thought about it, the more excited he became. Recalling the shame of thousands of years, he stared at the black spot on the tree root. After a moment of silence, he finally raised his head and suddenly said, "Junior Su Li, let me tell you in advance. If the Grand Elder of Yushu sect is too strong, I will feel my life is in danger, then Senior can escape. Junior definitely won't have the slightest resentment." Su Li narrowed her eyes and said firmly, "Is that true?" "Of course." "Good." Bizhui roared and finally made a decision in his heart. A faint red light flashed in his green pupils. Su Li, I agree with your deal. In the future, you can call me, and I will definitely help you. Senior, you are really straightforward. Su Li showed a relieved smile on her face. It will take half a month to melt the tactical matrix. However, if the tactical matrix is completely melted, it will definitely be noticed by Yushu sect. So, I will destroy the nodes of the tactical matrix and then integrate fake runes. It looks the same as the original runes, but in fact, it has no binding effect at all. As she said, she pinched a gesture with both hands. The transparent runes of the tactical matrix flowed from her fingers and integrated into the tree root that was destroyed just now. In an instant, the black spot on the tree root disappeared. Bizhui tried to sense it, and he could still detect the flaw, but it was invisible on the surface. Bizhui nodded happily. That's great. You really came prepared. You've thought it through. Thank you for your hard work in the past half-month. Senior, you don't need to thank me. It's just a deal. Su Li shook her head and said in a deep voice, I can't keep myself hidden during the time of melting the tactical matrix. Please help me, Senior. Haha, it's not a big deal. You focus on melting the tactical matrix, and I won't let anyone disturb you. Bizhui laughed loudly. This was related to his freedom. Even if Su Li didn't say it, he would spare no effort to cover up the movement. Then I will start now. Su Li responded and sat down cross-legged. She cut her wrist and let the blood spill out, turning into drops of blood beads and flying to various nodes of the imprisonment tactical matrix. At the same time, her hands also turned into residual shadows, and the repaired and transparent runes of the tactical matrix flew out one after another, following the blood beads. Bijui's face was hidden in the core, but he had been paying attention to Su Li's movements all the time. Seeing that she was so focused, he felt a lot calmer and even faintly excited. A touch of expectation appeared in his old eyes. He didn't know whether his hometown was still there. After regaining freedom, he would go back and never come to Jojo region again. Immersed in joy, the old tree man didn't notice that when the dark red blood melted the tactical matrix, it also melted into the roots and spread wantonly along the veins of the tree. Not only did Bizhui fail to notice it, but Black Lotus also failed to notice it. In the ring space, Black Lotus touched his chin and clicked his tongue in wonder. When did Su Li find that the blood of evil ghost could also destroy the tactical matrix? But the old guy of Spirit Clan doesn't seem to keep the promise. Why does Su Li trust him? Black Lotus was puzzled. Since Su Li was reborn, she had never suffered any loss. She had always been tricking others. Isn't it too early to deal with Yushu sect now? What on earth is little Su Li thinking? Black Lotus looked at the fragments in his hand and sighed. Which treasure did these fragments come from? They are so broken that I can't recognize them at all. She asked me to put them away without giving me a hint. I can't live on. In the desperate domain of demons and demons, a bonfire shone warmly in the ice and snow. Beside the bonfire, two people sat opposite each other. Su Buwang was holding his bare arms. His lips were blue and he kept shivering. He stared at the clothes beside the bonfire that emitted blue cold mist without blinking. On the other side of the bonfire, there was a bearded young man who was slovenly like a beggar. Su Buwang could only see the young eyes through the gaps of his messy hair. You are really reckless. You even dare to jump into the desperate lake. Don't you know that the cold breath in the lake can't be dissolved by those above Yuanying realm? The slovenly young man handed over a freshly roasted fish. Beneath his dirty face, he spoke with a voice that was as gentle as jade. I just heard that there is an immortal who can realize wishes at the bottom of the lake, so I come to have a look. Su Buwang chuckled and took a bite of the roasted fish. He said vaguely, besides, I met Senior. Senior, you have a high cultivation. You saved me from the lake with one hand. You must be more than Yuanying realm. May I know your name? The slovenly young man shook his head helplessly. This silly boy was really friendly. The spiritual firewood of Fiery Island can speed up the dispersal of the cold air in your body. Warm yourself by the fire and don't get any internal injuries. Su Buwang's eyes lit up when he heard that. He looked at the burning firewood and exclaimed, It turns out that this is the spiritual firewood of Fiery Island. It's the first time that I have seen it. Have you heard of it? The young man was stunned and immediately laughed. I should have known that you have a good background. Otherwise, you would have died long ago if you came here alone. Wow, senior, your words are so hurtful. Su Buwang's face showed exaggerated indignation, and the young man smiled. Suddenly, his eyes moved, and the ordinary flying sword at his feet disappeared in an instant. Su Buwang's pupils shrank slightly, and he suddenly turned around to look. This made his body completely stiff and unable to breathe. There were tears in his eyes. I have escaped to here, and you still won't let me go? Behind him, two white-robed cultivators who had been hiding in the snow revealed themselves. There were originally 3 of them, but the flying sword of the person in the front had already reached his back. It was only an inch away from piercing his skin and shattering his heart. However, before he could do that, his head was already separated from his body. He died so fast. Was it the senior who killed him? Su Buwang's mind was a little confused. Suddenly he heard the cold and stern voice of the young man behind him, which was completely different from the previous gentleness. Are you from Shengtian Shrine? The remaining 2 people's faces changed slightly when their origins were known. They turned around and fled without saying anything. But before they fled a few feet away, they saw a dazzling sword light flashing in front of them. It was extremely fast and passed through their throats. You are Tian. One of them covered his throat and said 3 words with his eyes wide open. Then he died. Tian. Tian what? Su Buwang stared blankly at the 3 people who died in an instant. He looked back and saw the beggar-like young man sit down again, and the seemingly ordinary flying sword also returned to him. Seeing Su Buwang in a daze, the beggar-like young man smiled, and his tone was as gentle as before. You are frightened. Shengtian Shrine has been chasing me for a long time. In recent years, they have stopped a lot. I didn't expect that they would appear again today. Su Buwang was a little confused. He was sure that those people were definitely coming to kill him, but they were misunderstood by the beggar-like young man, and they were also killed by him. 3 killers in Yuanying realm couldn't live for more than a breath. What level of strength was this? Su Buwang's eyes brightened. My life of escape was over. The only self-esteem in his heart made him stop the idea of hugging the beggar-like young man's thigh immediately. He just saluted respectfully and shouted, Senior, please take me with you. The beggar-like young man suddenly laughed. I don't accept disciples. Your temperament is similar to mine. Why don't we be friends despite the difference in age? Okay. Su Buwang immediately climbed up the pole. He cupped his hands and said cheerfully, I am Su Buwang. I am more than 1,000 years old this year. Big brother, please give me more advice. Patter, the grilled fish in the beggar-like young man's hand fell to the ground instantly. What's your name? Chapter 435. When Su Buwang saw the young beggar's face change in an instant, his heart thumped, and he ran away without saying anything. But before he could leave on his flying sword, he felt the back of his neck tighten, and the scenery around him rapidly retreated. In less than a breath's time, he was back beside the bonfire. The cold energy in your body hasn't been removed yet. Why are you running? There was a little more annoyance in the voice of the young beggar, as well as a trace of disbelief and surprise that Su Buwang could hardly detect. Su Buwang laughed hollowly for a moment, and his eyes kept rolling. When he found that he had no chance to escape, he finally cried and whined, Senior, I really don't belong to Shengtian Shrine. Those 3 people were chasing after me just now. I'm really sorry for implicating Senior. I see. The beggar looked at Su Buwang's face with a smile in his eyes. I was wondering why the people of Shengtian Shrine didn't learn the lesson, and the strength of the killer they sent was lower than last time. It turned out to be you. So you want to follow me because you want me to be your bodyguard? Seeing that the young beggar didn't mean to be angry, Su Buwang couldn't help but secretly breathe a sigh of relief. He smiled awkwardly. Senior, what are you talking about? I have always been at odds with Shengtian Shrine, and so do you. We have the same enemy, so we should be united against the common enemy. Maybe I will be more powerful than you and destroy Shengtian Shrine at once. Don't you think so? The beggar looked at Su Buwang's playful look and was in a daze. Is he, your son? He's not like you at all. He doesn't seem to have inherited any of your calmness and intelligence. Instead, he's very lively. On the other side, Su Buwang sat cross-legged and sensed for a moment. He found that the cold air in his body had been completely cleared. He immediately put on his clothes and saw that the beggar was staring at him absent-mindedly. He couldn't help but have goosebumps all over his body. This person can't be that, right? Su Buwang felt disgusted and quickly got rid of the absurd thoughts in his mind, but he still couldn't help feeling flustered. He asked cautiously, "Senior, why do you always look at me?" The young beggar immediately came back to his senses. He turned around and said casually, "It's nothing. Seeing you reminded me of some old matters." Oh, Su Buwang echoed and felt strange in his heart. They just met each other today. Could the senior still remember the past when he saw him? Who are you trying to fool? It can't really be that, right? Su Buwang was perturbed. The beggar suddenly asked, "What wish do you want to realize by coming to the Lake of Absolute Regions?" "Of course I'm here to look for my mother." Su Buwang patted his chest as a matter of course. It was so beautiful that the young beggar's face changed instantly under his messy hair. He continued, "My mother has been missing for many years. Although I don't know where she is, she must still be alive. I must find her." "Did your father tell you all this?" The young beggar's voice seemed to be suppressing something, and his tone changed. When Su Buwang heard that word, his face also changed, and he snorted, "Senior, I have no father. His father had died a long time ago, and he had died a terrible death. I overheard everything that happened to my mother. That's why I came out to look for her. Then we'll have to search carefully." The young beggar's voice fell, and his tone became low, but his eyes suddenly brightened. Su Buwang was still alive. He was very surprised. When he returned to the sect, the first news he heard was Shengtian Shrine's evil emperor came back with his son, and the second news was Shengtian Shrine's evil emperor killed his son in front of all his concubine. That scene was seen by many people. He always thought that Su Buwang had died, but he didn't expect that this boy was not only alive, but also reached the early stage of Yuanying realm. Was that person soft-hearted? But according to this boy's tone, it seemed that he lived a very unhappy life in Shengtian Shrine these years. The specific situation needed to be explored slowly. The young beggar's eyes were slightly gloomy, and his depression was swept away. At this moment, Su Buwang felt that the young man in front of him seemed to be a little different, but he couldn't tell specifically. The biting cold wind blew, and Su Buwang shivered. Suddenly, he heard the young man sigh. "Boy, call me Uncle Fang from now on." Shengtian Shrine, the top of the Black Cloud Mountain. In front of the towering hall, Ling Li wore a black robe. His snow-white hair covered his thin face and gloomy eyes. The smell of blood was steaming. He stood silently for a moment, pushed open the door, and left a line of blood under his feet. "You're back." The shadow in the dark turned around, and there was no lack of appreciation in his tone. "Well done. 3 of the 4 talents of Ankuei Valley have been killed, and most of the core disciples have been killed by you. The next top of the Tianjiao list will definitely be Shengtian Shrines." Ling Li stood silently and just looked at the black shadow coldly. The atmosphere was stagnant for a moment, and then it was broken by the laughter of the black shadow. "What? Don't tell me you want a reward. No matter whether you have a relationship with me or not, you have the blood of my Ling family flowing in your body. It is your mission to be loyal to Shengtian Shrine, Li." "I'm tired of hearing the 3 words of Lihan Tablet." Ling Li finally spoke in a flat tone, and his long and narrow eyes reflected the cold silver light. "How did you find Su Buwang?" "Oh, have you found him?" The black shadow smiled. "That bastard is really stupid. Although he has the young jade mask, he has been using his real name to leave traces everywhere. How difficult it is for me to find him. But he is very tough. I sent people to find him several times, but they all failed. I told you, don't touch him." Ling Li spoke slowly, and there was a pressure around him, but it couldn't affect the black shadow. The black shadow squinted and glanced at the corner of his clothes that was still dripping with blood. The matter of Huangxing Hall is over. Why should I keep him? Bloodline is above everything. You know, I will never allow. He is not a member of the Ling family. Ling Li interrupted the words of the black shadow, and his words were full of killing intent. I can kill the talents of Ankue Valley, and I can also kill the talents of Shengtian Shrine. How dare you? The black shadow's eyes were full of anger, but Ling Li laughed coldly. Not all the people of Shengtian Shrine are from the Ling family. I didn't violate the oath at all. It's not a good deal to lose the top of the Qianjiao list for Su Buwang this year. Are you threatening me? Ling Li, it seems that you think your wings are strong enough. How dare you disobey me? The black shadow approached slowly, and Ling Li smiled faintly. I don't dare. I'm just stating a fact. The Lord of Shengtian Palace never makes a losing deal. I leave. After that, Ling Li nodded slightly and turned away, leaving only a faint smell of blood. The black shadow was silent, as if anger was slowly accumulating, but it didn't break out until Ling Li's back disappeared behind the palace gate. Monitor Su Buwang's whereabouts. After the Qianjiao list, take action. Yes, Lord. In the adytum, Ling Li took off his black robe expressionlessly and threw it aside, revealing dense wounds, some of which were so deep that bones could be seen, and the beating organs could be vaguely seen. How could it be so easy to kill the second talent of Ankue Valley, and dozens of inherited disciples who had the opportunity to become talents? Especially in the case that he couldn't expose his origin, he could only fight with his life for a chance to win. He looked at the water mirror that appeared in the nothingness and touched the hole next to his heart. There was still a trace of sharp metal intent, which was constantly eroding his flesh and blood. This shot almost made him go to see Li. Ling Li, don't go out to kill anymore. Jing Xin's tear-stained face was reflected in the half-mirror floating on the side. Ling Li didn't seem to hear it. He opened the healing tactical matrix and sat cross-legged in the center, but he didn't meditate. Instead, a jadebone mask appeared in his hand, Yin Jade Mask. Sensing the indistinct pneuma on the mask, Ling Li's cold face instantly softened. I should have reunited with you long ago, but when I think of Wang, how could he be at ease? Especially when that old fellow had actually tracked down Wang Er's tracks. Although he had temporarily stabilized the situation with the prodigy's role, once the prodigy's role was finalized, Wang Er would definitely be in danger again. Before the Qianjiao list is determined, I must send him to Tianhe Sec. If not, I must send him to a force that Shengtian Shrine absolutely can't reach. Ling Li fell to the ground powerlessly and fell asleep. The healing tactical matrix was still shining with green fluorescence, and Jing Xin's sobs were faintly heard. In the blink of an eye, 1 month passed in a flash. Zhouzhou region was quiet and peaceful. Except for some small sects fighting with each other, the 25 sects were as calm as a pool of stagnant water. No one mentioned the tea party for immortals. At this moment, in the seemingly calm tea peak of Yushu sect, Su Li stood quietly in front of the core of the green tea plant with a pale face. When she saw the soul-stirring blood color in the core of the tea plant, a smile appeared on her face. At this time, Bijue's face appeared on the surface of the core of the tea plant, which was less lively than a month ago. Master! The roots swayed and surrounded Su Li like stars around the moon, as if they were worshipping the emperor. Black Lotus in the Black Lotus ring stared at the puppet-like tea plant in a daze, and a strong chill emerged from the bottom of his heart. Why did Su Li's talent awaken so quickly and so strangely? He didn't notice it at all. How did Su Li know it? Su Li pursed her lips and asked softly, "Tell me everything about me in those days, no matter how big or small. What is the daughter of luck?" "Yes, master." Bizhui answered blankly, "I have heard a lot of legends about the daughter of luck. This kind of woman is born to condense luck in herself and has endless opportunities. She is the unique talent in the cultivation circle. The heavenly Tao is constant and will definitely not allow such a woman to appear. Therefore, the daughter of Providence will not be born through normal means. Throughout history, the daughter of Providence has been forcefully calculated and arranged to be born by almighty cultivators who are proficient in numerology." Speaking of this, Bizhui looked at Su Li blankly. Master, everything you have experienced since you were born is deliberately arranged by others. You constantly condense luck and provide opportunities for others, until heaven is angry and people resent, and you can't have a good end. Chapter 436. No good end, Su Li murmured. Her lips trembled slightly, and her bloodless face became more haggard. She sat down slowly, and her face sank into her arms, completely covering her fragile look. Little Su Li, you, Black Lotus called her softly, but the second half of the sentence was stuck in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He scratched his head with a headache. From the moment Su Yuanhai said the words the Daughter of Destiny, he had a hunch that it had something to do with the unlucky Daughter of Destiny. He was afraid that Su Li couldn't bear it and would go crazy like before, so he didn't dare to mention a word. He just wanted to tell Su Li when she was stronger. Unfortunately, man proposes, God disposes. The immortal tea plant was controlled, which completely disrupted his plan. It was so quiet in the core space of the tea plant that even a pin drop could be heard. Only Su Li was lying on her knees in silence, and her dark eyes were shining with an incomprehensible light. She had thought a lot about the previous life and told herself that no matter how cruel the truth was, she would rather regret after knowing the truth than live a muddle-headed life. But now, she was really confused. Bizhui told her that everything was fake. The people and things in the previous life, as well as her life, were just plots arranged by others, and she was a puppet in the hands of the behind-the-scenes person. When the strings connecting the puppet were broken one day, would the puppet's life come to an end? Who is that person? Su Li's hoarse voice echoed in the space. I don't know, but he must be at the top of the pyramid in Qingshui Circle. Otherwise, how could he take advantage of the loophole under the nose of natural law? If it were someone with low cultivation, he would have died because of the backfire of natural law, and you couldn't have been born. Then, Su Li stood up in Black Lotus's uneasy eyes. She straightened her back and took a deep breath. Then, she suddenly opened her eyes, and her eyes were bright and breathtaking. In other words, my birth parents and I are just chess pieces in the hands of others. We don't have any dignity as human beings. She smiled, and her smile was full of mockery. I once swore that after my rebirth, I would never become anyone's chess piece again. But in the end, it was just a dream. Outside the game is still a game. I can't escape even if I have wings. Now, Black Lotus, tell me, am I still a chess piece? Of course not. Looking at Su Li's calm smile, Black Lotus couldn't help but shiver. He quickly comforted her, as long as I am here, you can definitely catch those bastards who played with you and punish them one by one. Su Li curled her lips slightly and instantly covered all the fluctuating emotions. I think so too. Bizhui, do you know the origin of a person named Ling Li in the bloody accident of Holy Spirit 1,000 years ago? This old servant doesn't know. Back then, only those geniuses who were on the prodigy list left behind a great reputation. The others were all lost in the crowd. Su Li was surprised. Was Ling Li not on the Tianjiao list? Fang Yuan ranked second. Who was the first on the Tianjiao list at that time? It was a holy son of the holy sect of the Evil Circle. His name was Evil Emperor. I don't know his real name. He occupied the first place on the Tianjiao list for 1,000 years until he was over 2,000 years old. Do you know his name? I don't know. Su Li asked a lot of questions, including what should be asked and what shouldn't be asked. She didn't stop until a few days later when she had no more questions. She sighed for a moment and turned her hand over. A pocket-sized cave appeared in her hand. Then the cave enlarged rapidly in the core space until it became the size of a normal house. Su Li waved her hand indifferently, and the stone door of the cave opened automatically. A pool of deep and clear water appeared in it. All the lotus leaves of Tianyu lotus were in full bloom, and a strong fragrance drifted out. Bizhui, instill all the power of enlightenment you have accumulated to me. As soon as Su Li finished her words, Bizhui immediately waved his branches. The core of the tea tree, which was as high as a person, cracked a little. A large amount of fragrant essence of enlightenment flowed out, and then turned into water lines that flew into the nothingness and integrated into Su Li's body. The next moment, Su Li immediately sensed that there were more thoughts in her mind, which was similar to the feeling of using the soul stone last time. But this time, it was not for the secret method of the soul, but for Sueyu tactics. Black Lotus was stunned when he saw this scene. An absurd thought flashed in his mind. Little Su Li, are you going to forcibly break through the second level of Sueyu tactics? Are you crazy? What was Sueyu tactics? It was the most precious treasure of the Kueyu Palace in ancient times. It was extremely difficult to understand it. He knew that Su Li was extremely difficult to practice it, and she was still stuck in the first level. But it was not strange. Even in ancient times, most of the disciples of the Kueyu Palace who practiced Sueyu tactics were stuck in the first level of Sueyu tactics all their lives, and they couldn't understand the true meaning of Sueyu tactics. But it didn't hinder practice. Many people even reached the level of the mighty in ancient times by only relying on the first level of Sueyu tactics. Even those powerful people couldn't break through the second level. Su Li was just in Zhuji realm now. How could she dream of breaking through? Wasn't she crazy? Time is running out. Su Li said expressionlessly. She didn't stop moving. She picked up the Tianyu lotus and crushed it. Then she said the second half of the sentence, "Look at Bizhui." Black Lotus was stunned. He looked at the old face on the core. After sensing it carefully, his face changed slightly. The erosion is deepening. The power in my blood can't be controlled. Su Li extracted the essence of the Tianyu lotus drop by drop and stored it in the prepared jade bottle. She said casually, "I have eroded his mind, and the poison in his blood is still invading his vitality. It won't take long for Yushu sect to notice its abnormality. I have to do it before that." Black Lotus gasped and couldn't help asking, "How much time do you have?" "At most, 10 years. 10 years. Black Lotus was so scared that his voice became sharp. "It's too short. What can you do in 10 years? It will take you several years to cultivate at the peak of Zhuji realm. After breaking through Zhuji realm, you will be watched more closely by the natural law. You can't do anything at will. There are many old monsters in the 25 sects. You don't have the strength of the peak of Huashan realm. How can you escape unscathed? So, I'll take a gamble." Su Li picked up the jade bottle and shook it. Looking at the transparent juice in the jade bottle, a deep light appeared in her eyes. "Dongfang Wuxue." "Yes, master." A phantom floated out of the cave and looked at the remaining Tianyu lotus with a touch of desire in his eyes. Su Li raised her eyes and said in a gentle tone, "I have refined the cave completely. I can set you free at any time. Originally, I wanted to find a physical body for you to possess. But there are many restrictions in possession, which are not good for your practice." Master, Dongfang Wuxue was moved. Hearing this, he already understood Su Li's plan. The Tianyu lotus was the best container for cultivating a physical body. Now everything was ready. Only a little bit of vitality was needed. "Bizhui." Su Li called him in a low voice. The roots at the end of the core of the swaying giant tree behind her immediately fell off and turned into green powder, wrapping Dongfang Wuxue with strong vitality. At the same time, Su Li stretched out her hand and grasped. The connection between Dongfang Wuxue and the cave was instantly cut off. The Tianyu lotus automatically split open and wrapped Dongfang Wuxue's phantom in it, turning it into a green cocoon. After that, Su Li waved her hand to seal the cave, and her mind quickly sank into the second level of Sueyu tactics. She wanted to see what was so special about this cultivation technique that had been highly respected since the ancient times. Black Lotus watched her make all the arrangements in a daze and couldn't help swallowing. In his opinion, this poor girl, who had been played by others all her life, became unfathomable for the first time in his eyes. It turns out that her goal is Bizhui from the beginning to the end. This plan is interlocking and she makes use of Bizhui to the extreme. She is so shrewd. Did she plan before she knew that she could go to the head branch of the Su family? Black Lotus suddenly shuddered with fear. Would I be used by Su Li and abandoned like a pair of worn-out shoes one day, just like Bizhui? Seeing Bijue's almost dull face, Black Lotus shuddered. No, I'm an ancient treasure. How could Su Li, that little girl, hurt me? Black Lotus's voice became lower and lower in the end. He looked at Su Li's little face, which was immersed in enlightenment, and his eyes became complicated. I hope that day won't come. The sun was shining brightly in the mountain. Su Yang was lying on the tree with a blade of grass in his mouth. Watching Su Mu practicing magic under the tree, he felt bored and pursed his lips. He said vaguely, "Blockhead, you've been practicing for 2 months. Don't you feel bored? I mean, did Su Jojo die in Yushu sect? If she died, Su Yang's face suddenly changed slightly and he rolled down from the tree. The next moment, crack! The huge tree was divided into 2 halves by a sword light. Yang Zai walked slowly in the smoke and dust with a cold face and said in a cold tone, "If you say one more bad word about the master, Ni sect will not let you live." Su Yang got up from the ground with his face covered in dirt and cursed angrily, "Yang Zai, you son of a bitch. You play dirty every time. If you have the ability, don't use your sword skills. Let's have a good fight. You have stayed in Tianhe sect for 1,000 years, but your cultivation has not advanced but regressed. You are getting more and more shameless." Yang Zai snorted coldly and turned to look at Su Mu, who was covered with ice chips. He frowned and said nothing. Su Yang was so angry that his eyes turned red. He said angrily, "Well, Yang Zai, after a trip to Reincarnation Mirror, you are so arrogant. If it weren't for your weird sword skills, how could I not be your opponent? The sword skills that the master taught me are extraordinary." Yang Zai heard him praising the sword skills, and there was a trace of admiration in his eyes. Su Yang felt disgusted and wiped his cold sweat. He muttered, "Forget it. I won't argue with a person whose soul is controlled." Su Mu stopped casting the spell. He glanced at the 2 of them and didn't say anything. Then he continued to cast the spell. Ice chips flew everywhere. Chapter 437. In the core space of the tea plant, Su Li sat cross-legged in the nothingness like a statue. It was really not so easy to break through Sueyu tactics. With the help of the essence of enlightenment and Tianyu lotus, she fumbled in countless thoughts, but she could not break through the bottleneck of Sueyu tactics, which seemed to be as thin as paper. Black Lotus appeared. He glanced at Dongfang Wuxue, who was still rebuilding his physical body, and sighed softly. It seemed that Su Li heard Black Lotus's sigh, and made a move in the next moment. With a crisp sound, the jade token in her right hand was shattered. In the horrified eyes of Black Lotus, she poured all the remaining juice of Tianyu lotus into the awareness sea. The thousands of thoughts immediately multiplied exponentially. In the blink of an eye, there were more than 1,000,000 thoughts, and they were moving toward 10 million in a split second. Su Li had a splitting headache, and her waterfall-like black hair turned into white snow in the blink of an eye. "Su Li, wake up." Black Lotus's anxious and sharp voice came into the awareness sea. "The number of thoughts is beyond the limit you can bear. If you hold on, your head will explode like fireworks, and you will die. Su Li, do you hear me?" Su Li tightened her lips, gritted her teeth, and continued to push the thoughts. Her mouth and nose were bleeding, and she was indifferent. She could not find the breakthrough of Sueyu tactics with tens of thousands of deduction routes. What about hundreds of thousands, millions, or even tens of thousands of kinds? Snap! It seemed that the sound of a rope breaking came from her head, and her snow-white hair was stained with blood in the blink of an eye. Black Lotus's heart trembled, and he dared not to disturb Su Li, for fear that his voice would be the last straw and completely crush Su Li's mind. Snap! 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 More and more sounds appeared. Su Li, who was wandering in the thoughts in the awareness sea, finally sensed the signs of death. If she continued, she would die. Did I fail? Su Li suddenly opened her eyes, and her eyes were dim. She saw the thoughts in the awareness sea constantly falling into nothingness because of her loosened mind. Suddenly, she had a thought, and her mind sank with the thoughts. The breath of life disappeared instantly. Su Li, Black Lotus was horrified. He looked up and saw the dull face on the core of the tea plant. He thought silently for a moment, and suddenly found that what he could do now was to wait. In the darkness of nothingness, there were thoughts that turned into specks of white light, just like the starry sky. As it continued to sink, the white light gradually disappeared, until finally, only darkness remained. In such darkness, Su Li couldn't even feel her own existence. If she didn't have a trace of obsession in her heart, she would have disappeared with the idea. After a long time, the darkness faded. Su Li opened her eyes weakly and saw a secular city without color. What is this place? As her mind shook slightly, Su Li looked down and saw a pair of almost transparent palms. She was silent for a while and walked to the front of the city. As he neared the entrance of the small city, he could hear the bustling sounds of the city. Su Li narrowed her eyes. She faintly felt a sense of familiarity, but she had no impression after thinking about it carefully. There were 2 guards standing at the gate of the city. From time to time, they came to ask the identity of the people coming and going, but they never looked at Su Li. Can't see me? Su Li thought to herself and stepped into the city gate. As expected, the guards did not stop her. But the moment she stepped into the city gate, the surrounding scenery suddenly flowed backward. In the blink of an eye, Su Li returned to the original place. Can't get close. Su Li had a guess in her mind. She tried to enter the city several times, but she returned to the original place every time. It seemed that she could only see this fragment. Returning to the outside of the city gate again, Su Li looked at the black and white world that was incompatible with her. There was a trace of understanding in her eyes. The constantly repeating memory fragments. Whose memory were these? Su Li asked herself. Finally, she sighed softly and took a step back. Then, everything in front of her returned to darkness, but Su Li was very calm. She chose a new direction and entered the next memory fragment soon after. This time, it was not the city gate, but a place that Su Li was familiar with. Yunshan Yard, Su Li whispered softly and walked to the yard in her memory with ease. She saw the girl in cotton clothes sitting alone on the ground and playing. The foster mother next to her was looking at her with a smile and mending new clothes for her. Su Li stared at this scene in a daze. After a long time, she walked to the girl and gently squatted down. At this moment, the previous life and the current life seemed to break through the change of time and space and overlapped. The next moment, the memory fragments flowed backward. Su Li returned to the outside of Yunshan Yard. After a moment of silence, she walked to the yard where Su Yuanhai used to live. But the fragments flowed backward again before she reached the yard. In this memory, did she still not know Su Yuanhai? Without trying again, Su Li withdrew from the fragment and continued to look for the next memory. The fragments, either short or long, gradually pieced together the blank childhood memory. Su Li, like an outsider, calmly watched the scenes that happened as Su Yuanhai said. She saw the ecstatic faces of the dead Su Huani and his brother, the young Su Huanli, and the vague outline of the black shadow that fed her the illusionarizing powder. In the end, everything returned to darkness. Su Li's eyes were absolutely calm. Although she knew in her heart that this was what she experienced in her previous life as a child, she couldn't empathize with it. It was as if she was looking at the memory of a stranger. Even if I see the memory fragments, I can't go back. Is it the effect of the illusionarizing powder? Su Li thought and turned away without any reluctance. The darkness hadn't disappeared yet. Dullness and loneliness followed her like a shadow. Su Li gradually felt cold. After experiencing so many memory fragments, her soul had been too weak. It wouldn't take long for it to dissipate. If it really dissipated, it would be no different from death, leaving only a physical body for others to possess. But what Su Li was thinking now was not death. She looked at the deep darkness, and her eyes were full of desire. Time passed gradually. After a long time, Su Li found that she couldn't walk anymore. Her lower body disappeared, so she could only crawl. The boundless darkness made people desperate. The light in Su Li's eyes faded gradually, but the obsession was still there. The crystal soul flew out spots of white light and dotted the darkness. As the upper body also began to disappear, Su Li's mind shook and let out a slight sigh. But she still didn't give up and kept moving toward the unknown depths. Finally, at a certain moment, her hands also disappeared, leaving only her head. Su Li's almost transparent eyes flickered with a crazy obsession. She bit the ground with her teeth and kept moving. She didn't know what was the obsession that supported her to keep moving, but she knew that she had to move forward. The white light spots illuminated a small area, but Su Li couldn't see it. She only had the lower half of her face left, but she was still moving forward tirelessly. Gradually, the lower half of her face disappeared, and she couldn't move forward anymore. At the moment when the soul completely disappeared, the light of the obsession suddenly shone to every corner of the dark space. At this moment, Su Li suddenly saw everything. She didn't know what else she was looking at. In her eyes, there were countless threads intertwined together, and many parallel threads crisscrossed without any intersection. Instinctively, Su Li stretched out her mind and touched one of the bright red threads. Suddenly, a mountain-like soul fragment in the distance suddenly approached and rushed into Su Li's mind. The substantial soul power wrapped Su Li and quickly nourished Su Li's soul, which was damaged to the extreme. In less than a breath, Su Li's mind projection reappeared. This time, it was no longer a phantom, but a real body, indestructible. All kinds of changes happened so fast that Su Li didn't have time to think too much. The threads in front of her all faded away, and then a huge and messy primitive memory washed over her. Su Li only had time to remember a few words, and the torrent of memory completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Sin Clan. Lihan Tablet. Su Li looked at the gradually darkening space around her and murmured to herself. Her mind was fixed on the warm picture of a couple holding swaddling clothes, but she couldn't see the couple's faces clearly. It's over. Su Li didn't know what happened to her, but she instinctively had a lot of abilities. While the space was not completely dark, she pointed between her fingers and gathered the white light into a light door. Then she stepped into it without hesitation. The next moment, Su Li suddenly opened her eyes and saw the familiar core space of the tea plant. A faint thread was reflected in her eyes, but the thread soon blurred. However, she still saw clearly that the two ends of the thread were connected to her and Black Lotus. The daughter of destiny, a thought flashed in Su Li's mind. Before she thought about it, she heard Black Lotus shouting, "Master, you are finally alive." Woo! Su Li raised her hand and saw the black shadow of Black Lotus ring, which was much clearer than before. She was slightly shocked. How long has it been? Subconsciously, she turned her head to look at Bizhui, but Bizhui was still the same as before. Seeing that Su Li seemed to have no soul injury, Black Lotus also breathed a sigh of relief and rolled his eyes. You have lost your breath for 5 days. I almost thought you were dead, and I was about to find a new master. Really? Su Li raised her eyebrows. Then I'm a little curious about what will happen to you if you fall into the hands of Yushu sect. Black Lotus's face darkened. As a treasure of Ghost Clan, how could it end well if it fell into the hands of Human Clan? Even if Black Lotus ring could be kept in the end, his spiritual body would definitely be used to refine elixirs. Little Su Li, can't you save me some face? Black Lotus sighed helplessly. After a moment of silence, he finally couldn't hold back his curiosity and asked aloud, "You have maintained that weird state for 7 days. What did you do? Did you really break through the second level of Sueyu tactics?" Su Li shook her head and smiled faintly. It is not so easy to break through the second level of Sueyu tactics. Then why are you not anxious? Black Lotus couldn't understand, but Su Li ignored him and turned to Bizhui. From now on, pay close attention to all the actions of Yushu sect and report to me at any time. Hearing her instructions, Black Lotus didn't care about the previous problem and clapped his hands in amazement. As strong as the old monsters of Yushu sect, they will never think that immortal tea plant is a traitor. Su Li, your move is really wonderful. Chapter 438. The Poisonous Wife. Chapter 438. Stupid donkey currently typing. Please wait a moment. After the content has been updated, Please refresh the page to receive the latest update. Chapter 439. What? There was a slight sound of surprise in the nothingness, and then it disappeared in an instant. Su Li stretched out her hand, and a long sword flew out from the weapon rack behind her and floated in front of her. She made a strange gesture in the blink of an eye and poured it into the long sword. The ordinary long sword was instantly plated with a layer of cyan light, and then it shot out like a snake. AO sword skills, the sword raining skill. There was a cold snort in the nothingness. The purple light condensed in the middle-aged man's hand and turned into a sword again. He rushed forward and cut dozens of times at a speed that Su Li couldn't see clearly. Ding, ding, ding. The two swords collided fiercely, and sparks flew everywhere. Su Li changed the gesture in her hand and concentrated on resisting the attack. Although she was still affected by the blank consciousness, she had time to react because of the distance and managed to maintain the situation. Every time after the blank consciousness, there was a black light flowing in Su Li's eyes, and the discomfort was dispelled faster and faster. They collided hundreds of times, and neither of them showed any fatigue. Swish. The middle-aged man used old moves and showed weakness. Su Li, who was supposed to be blank and unable to attack, suddenly became clear. She slipped into the middle-aged man's arms and held the hilt with one hand. The power of pneuma and blood burst out, and the long sword immediately turned into an electric light and penetrated the middle-aged man's chest. Break. Boom. The sword exploded, and a basin-sized hole was blown out of the middle-aged man's chest. All the internal organs were shattered, but the middle-aged man seemed to feel no pain. He turned his wrist, and the purple light sword suddenly cut to Su Li's neck. Su Li's throat was immediately scratched with blood, but she still didn't avoid it. Her eyes were terrible. Swish. The broken sword crossed the nothingness, and the middle-aged man's head flew high. All the movements stopped abruptly. Su Li gently breathed out and pushed away the long sword on her neck. She stepped back a few steps and stood in front of the headless middle-aged man. She wiped the wound on her neck, which was 2 inches deep. The high platform disappeared, and the steps of the star path appeared. Different from before, the white steps were covered with blood and became dark red. Junior, you are good. You have an hour to rest. If you don't step into the 4th test within an hour, the 3rd stone step will collapse. You know the result very well. Su Li heard the familiar voice, but she turned a deaf ear to it. She sat down cross-legged and mobilized her pneuma and blood to recover from the injury. Her pale face gradually became ruddy, and the wound on her neck was shrinking. But it was much slower than before. No matter how strong the physical body is, there is still a limit. The implication was that she wanted to continue the test. Stubborn. 10 hours. There was a hint of anger in the voice beside his ear, but it faded away and disappeared into nothingness. Su Li's eyes drooped slightly, and a trace of imperceptible sarcasm appeared at the corner of her mouth. Then she sat up cross-legged. No matter how serious her injury was, she ran the Sueyu tactics to restore her genuine energy. Seeing this, the owner of the voice in the dark showed a determined sneer. The sharp and harsh voice echoed in the area. Idiot who is courting death, no one can take away my things. While it was sneering, it did not find that the genuine energy of Sueyu tactics in the depths of Su Li's body was transformed into green vitality, moistening all parts of her body. All the broken meridians and bones were getting better at a speed visible to the naked eye. But all this was only limited to the inside of her body. From the outside, Su Li was still seriously injured and dying. Sometimes the Ghost Valley meditation direction obtained from the reincarnation mirror is more useful than Sueyu tactics. With this thought flashing in her mind, Su Li closed her eyes to hide the black light in them. She continued to run the Sueyu tactics to cover up the traces of healing. Her hands were full of cracks, but Su Li only repaired to the depth of the bones. She controlled not to grow flesh and blood. It was not until the 10th hour that a layer of dry flesh was attached to her hands. It's time, Junior. In the nothingness, the deep voice emerged again, and a pressure appeared out of nowhere, forcing Su Li to continue moving forward. Su Li stood up and glanced at the empty starry sky. Without saying much, she stepped on the seventh step, which was doomed to death in the eyes of the existence in the nothingness. A few days later, as soon as Su Li, who was covered with blood, appeared, she softly lay on the steps. There was a huge blood hole in her chest, which was the size of a fist. The granulation inside was slowly wriggling to repair the wound, but the speed was extremely slow. Her pneuma was extremely weak, like a candle flame swaying in the wind, which seemed to be extinguished by a blow. "Junior, you are really lucky. You didn't die." The deep voice in her ears was a little colder, but it was not obvious. "Go to the next step after 20 hours. Don't say that I didn't give you a chance to live." Su Li closed her eyes and didn't hear what the voice said at all. At this moment, she was immersed in the last sword light. The extremely gorgeous purple intent, the sharpness that could cut everything. She finally understood what it was. The sword intent, when practiced to the extreme, could cut the void. That was the sword intent that could cut the mind. Chapter 440. Time passed in the blink of an eye. When the 10th hour came, Su Li stood up and dragged her seemingly broken body to the 8th step without the reminder of the voice in the nothingness. Whoosh, the scene changed, and what came into view was the same high platform as before. Su Li walked to the weapon rack and picked up a long sword. She turned into a residual shadow and rushed to the middle-aged man without saying a word. His desperate stance was exactly the same as the previous 6 times. The existence in the nothingness looked coldly at the blood rain on the high platform, and a cold light flashed in its eyes. It thought that Su Li would die at the 5th step, but it didn't expect that this woman's toughness was far beyond its imagination. Unconsciously, she had persisted to the 8th step. "I've already used half of the sword intent left behind in the inheritance, yet a mere foundation establishment cultivator managed to survive until now. Where did this monster come from? This is simply absurd." It muttered to itself with anger and shock. There was a limit to changing the inheritance rules of the Star Road, and it was quite dangerous for him. Unless it was absolutely necessary, he did not want to take that risk. "Let's wait and see. If it really comes to that, I won't allow anyone to take my things." Boom, 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 boom. On the high platform, the two of them turned into afterimages and flickered crazily. Sword shadows were unceasing, and blood rained down. It was hard to tell whose blood it was. Su Li waved the long sword and released the control from time to time. She pinched the formula with both hands and switched between AO sword skills and Tsuashing skills seamlessly and freely. She was much more skillful than when she set foot on the star path. If Su Li's waving of the sword was just at the beginning of the rudimentary realm, as she fought with all her strength again and again, her sword was quickly polished and became smooth and perfect. The existence in the darkness sensed this change, and its expression became even more gloomy. "Shua." The middle-aged man took a step back, flicked his wrist, and changed the momentum of his sword. The dense purple sword light instantly turned into a sword net, and enveloped him. "Killing move." Su Li's eyes sharpened. She held the sword backhand and turned it upward. The whole sword body immediately turned into a rotating afterimage, breaking upward in the shape of a cone. Tsuashing, the 6th move, break. In an instant, a violent gust of wind blew in the field, and Su Li's figure was also swept in. She couldn't sense it clearly. The existence in the darkness stared at the two parties that were about to collide and smiled. Even in such a situation, he still wanted to comprehend a trace of sword intent and chose to face the killing move head-on. He was truly foolish to the extreme. No matter how good his talent was, it would still be a waste. It turned around and gradually disappeared into the depths of the void. It was not even prepared to watch the ending. It would be strange if he didn't die after forcefully fighting to the death in that exhausted state. Just then, boom, a strong wind pressure suddenly spread out, and in the blink of an eye, the net of swords was torn to shreds. The middle-aged man was also torn to shreds, and the pieces of his corpse even splashed to the feet of the incorporeal being. She won. The being in the void was shocked. He suddenly turned around and looked at the 8th stone step, just in time to see Ziyang fall from the sky, his clothes in tatters and his body covered in blood. Just like the previous 2 steps, he fell on the stone step and fainted from his heavy injuries. How did you win? The existence in the nothingness looked terrible, and he felt thirsty. He thought that Su Li would die, so he didn't watch the battle carefully. Luck. Or, this woman has been hiding her true strength all along. He muttered to himself, and then he growled, impossible. Even practitioners in Yuanying realm may not be able to pass such a test, let alone practitioners in Juji realm. I don't believe it. He widened his eyes and stared at Su Li, who was lying motionless on the stone step. He didn't miss the slightest detail. In the shock and absent-mindedness, he forgot to continue to lie about the healing time. He didn't realize it until Su Li woke up. At this time, more than 60 hours had passed. You did a good job. It's not easy to come here. The healing time of the first step is only 60 hours, and you have spent 30 hours. 10 hours later, go to the 9th step. Ignoring the severe pain, Su Li propped up her body with her arms and barely sat up. Her tone was full of suppressed anger. 10 hours? Why don't you just ask me to die? Seeing that she finally showed her emotions, the being in the dark subconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. This time, she was really at her limit. It was hateful that he had been hiding his true strength and deceiving her before. Fortunately, there was still a long way to go. Even if she didn't die on the 9th step, she definitely couldn't survive the test of the 10th step. There would be no accident. Thinking of this, he calmed down and continued to disguise his deep voice. He snorted coldly, I have given you a chance. You can't go back on your words when you come here. You. Su Li's blood-stained face was full of anger. She said with hatred, I now suspect that this star path was deliberately set by a destructive predecessor to kill the younger generation. I want to invite the arbitration of the star path. The being in the nothingness changed his expression slightly. Then he remembered that Su Li was only in Juji realm, and her soul body couldn't reach the perfect realm of Tianhun. The arbitration couldn't see through her. What was there to be afraid of? Thinking of this, he laughed and said confidently, you know the arbitration of the star path. Well, geniuses are always proud. Since you don't want to admit that you are too weak, you can invite the arbitration if you want. I won't stop you. Su Li's expression kept changing. She seemed to be struggling. After a while, she didn't make other moves. Instead, she seized the time to meditate and recover from her injury. Seeing this scene, the being in the nothingness smiled even more. You can't keep calm. That's a good thing. You are more likely to die if your state of mind is unstable. Let's see how long you can hold on. Su Li, who was sitting cross-legged on the stone step, looked pale. It was hard to tell whether she was angry or injured. She closed her eyes tightly, but her heart was calm, which was the opposite of the impetuous expression she showed. Her injury looked more serious. The white bones of her arms were full of cracks, as if they were porcelain that would fall apart. But Su Li knew that her real injury was much lighter than that on the previous step. After coming out of the illusion of the test, she didn't faint at all. Instead, she had been activating the Ghost Valley meditation direction to recover from her injury. She stayed for more than 10 hours while the being in the nothingness didn't respond. If she didn't guess it, the voice in the dark just now would only give her 40 hours to heal. It's only the 9th step. I haven't figured out how long it can affect the star path. My injury and pneuma haven't fully recovered. It's not easy to fall out with it. But, if it goes on like this, even a fool will know that I am pretending. When 10 hours passed, Su Li opened her eyes, and her eyes flickered. Falling out with it would happen sooner or later. From now on, get less injured. She took a step forward and stepped into the 9th step. Another fierce battle began on the high platform. But the being in the nothingness saw Su Li's desperate appearance and felt that something was wrong. How could she still have strength? Wasn't she seriously injured to the point that her arms were almost broken? How could she still hold the sword? The fighting puppet didn't feel pain. Didn't she feel pain? With more and more doubts and a more and more ominous premonition, the battle on the 9th step lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. It ended with Su Li cutting off one of her arms and piercing the puppet's head. Sure enough, she survived again. It stared at Su Li, whose arms and legs were separated on the 9th step, and suddenly felt a chill in its heart. What kind of monster did it provoke? There was even a faint regret in its heart, and it wanted to retreat. But at this point, neither it nor Su Li had a way out. It's the 10th step. She will definitely die, it muttered to itself, and its words were full of self-confidence that it didn't even realize. 40 hours, the 10th step. Su Li opened her eyes, and a cold voice immediately sounded in her ears. This voice was less lively than before, and more mechanical. It's not that person. He begins to doubt. Su Li was thoughtful. She picked up the right arm that was deliberately broken on the ground and reconnected it. She let it dangle on the side of her body, and closed her eyes to continue healing. Although it was very unreasonable that the healing time was only increased by 10 hours, she didn't pretend to be angry as before. Since they had a tacit understanding, some things were not necessary. There are different levels of arbitration. Just the gift of the star path won't have much influence on him. If I don't force him to make a big mistake, I will definitely die after the arbitration leaves. While healing, Su Li secretly pondered. Even if that person can affect the test of the star path, it will not be too much. Otherwise, if he directly promoted the strength of the puppet to Huashan realm or even higher, I would have been dead long ago. But it is also possible that he is not willing to take risks to deal with me. After all, for him, I am just an inconspicuous one among thousands of practitioners on the star path, and it is not worth it. But if I go to the last few steps, I may not. Su Li's eyes slightly sank, and she silently calculated for a moment in her heart. Then she was silent, and her mind was as calm as a lake without waves. When the hour was up, Su Li silently stepped on the 10th step. The 9th step to the 10th step was indeed a watershed. The purple sword light in the middle-aged puppet's hand was so dense that it was almost black. Every sword strike would leave a deep mark on the high platform. Su Li's situation was even more difficult. Every time she dodged and fought back, she almost brushed the edge of the sword edge, leaving crisscrossed scars, but every time the existence in the dark felt that she was about to be cut by the puppet's sword, Su Li would miraculously survive. No matter how badly she was injured, no matter how much he shortened the healing time, Su Li could continue to stand up and continue the next battle. The 11th step, the 12th step, every step was stained with blood. Su Li didn't know how many times she had bled. From the 10th step, she didn't say a word, but just fought tirelessly. The sword intent imprinted in her heart became clearer and clearer. Until the end of the 16th step, Su Li fell out of the illusion. When she was about to continue to heal, she finally heard the familiar but no longer vigorous voice. Enough. Su Li was slightly stunned. Looking at the middle-aged man who appeared in the nothingness, the face of gnashing teeth gradually became clear. She sneered. Under the middle-aged man's angry look, she laughed hoarsely and said, "The 16th step, you finally can't help it. You are more tolerant than I thought." As soon as these words came out, the middle-aged man's face was completely gloomy. Chapter 441. The middle-aged man in a purple robe landed on the stone steps. He looked dignified and beardless, but there was a little stubble on his face. There seemed to be smoke in his sharp eyes. Su Li opened her eyes and glanced at the ground. This man had no feet. Like Black Lotus, he was a spirit. "Have you found out that I lied to you?" The middle-aged man said in a sharp tone, which did not match his face. It was hard to tell whether he was a man or a woman, when, as soon as the words came out, there was an invisible pressure spreading on the stone platform. At this moment, Su Li had an illusion that she would be unpardonable if she didn't answer. In less than half a breath, many thoughts flashed through Su Li's mind. Finally, she struggled slightly and said unwillingly, There is no gift of the star path on the 5th stone step. Just because of this. The expression of the middle-aged man in a purple robe was stagnant, and a trace of regret flashed through his eyes. If he had known this, he wouldn't have done something so early. Maybe he would have given the gift of the star path at that time and let the woman recover from her injury. Then she would have no worries and die in the challenge carelessly. But now it was too late. He still held a glimmer of luck and didn't realize it until before the 17th step. How ridiculous it was. Looking at Su Li, who was struggling fiercely, he knew that the shock wouldn't last long. The rich purple-black light in his hand slowly condensed into a purple light sword. A breath that made Su Li's heart beat fast spread out. Holding the light sword, the middle-aged man in a purple robe showed hesitation in his eyes. He didn't want to do it himself. It didn't matter if the consciousness in the test of the star path secretly played tricks and killed 1 or 2 juniors. But if he did it himself, he was likely to be discovered. At that time, he would definitely be deprived of the right to stay here, and even be exiled to the abyss of fallen spirits. At the thought of the abyss of fallen spirits, the middle-aged man in a purple robe was deeply afraid. Finally, the purple light sword in his hand dissipated, and he said coldly, after 100 hours, go to the 17th step. If you can really finish the star path, I will give you part of the inheritance. He didn't dare to do it after all. After leaving this sentence, his figure disappeared instantly. Coincidentally, Su Li was also fully awake at this time. She looked dignified, as if she was considering the truth of that sentence. In his heart, he felt that it was a waste and dissipated the seal to invite the star path judge. She wasn't intimidated at all. With her soul, even if she hadn't undergone that transformation, she definitely wouldn't be affected by the purple-robed middle-aged man, let alone now. As for the purple-robed middle-aged man's words, she would be courting death if she believed him. 2 more levels. Su Li took a deep breath and sat down to heal. Time passed by. A few days later, there were only a few breaths left before the time limit of 100 hours. Su Li opened her eyes and thought for a moment. Finally, she chose to stand up and step on the 17th step. The scene on the high platform reappeared. This time, Su Li saw the face of the puppet clearly. It was the same as the face of the middle-aged man in the purple robe. The puppet stood silently in the field with a long sword in his hand, waiting for the arrival of his opponent. Su Li's eyes were clear. She didn't even look at the weapon rack. The same 3-foot Qingfeng sword flew out by itself and was caught in her hand. Then she said softly with a smile, "Let's start." Shua. Shua. The 2 figures instantly turned into shadows and filled the whole high platform. In the dark, the purple-robed spiritual body frowned and looked at the fierce battle on the high platform. He felt that something had changed in Su Li, but he couldn't tell the specifics. That thing must not be taken away. Just now, I have let her relax her vigilance with words and killed her instantly. In this way, the arbitration won't trouble me. With this thought in mind, the purple-robed spiritual body stared at Su Li's movements closely. After a dozen battles in succession, Su Li's combat experience improved rapidly, and her combat power was enhanced. But it also made him see clearly that there were no more than 6 movements in the swordsmanship that Su Li used. The most powerful move was a rotational swordsmanship that moved from the bottom to the top. He had seen it more than 10 times. If this woman dared to use this move, he had absolute confidence that he would be able to find an opening and give her a fatal blow. "Junior, you can only blame yourself for blocking my cultivation path. You deserve to die." The middle-aged man in a purple robe showed a ferocious look on his face, and the small purple sword in his hand condensed again. At the moment when the small purple sword condensed, Su Li suddenly shouted, and the long sword in her hand turned into a rotating sword shadow and flew to the puppet. Now, the eyes of the purple-robed spiritual body were full of ferocity. The small purple sword in his hand instantly drilled into the nothingness, and the next moment, it appeared at the back of Su Li's head without warning. He stared at Su Li's back, and his face showed a determined grin. At this moment, he suddenly saw Su Li turn around, and the square tripod-shaped gesture in her hand quickly enlarged. In his horrified eyes, a clear shout resounded through the nothingness. Arbitration of the star path, please. As soon as the voice fell, everything in the space was still, and a white figure slowly condensed, together with the small sword shining with strong purple light. How could it be? She had seen through me. The purple-robed spiritual body roared in his heart. He stared at the small purple sword with red eyes. Come back. Come back. But no matter how crazily he urged, the small sword seemed to be stuck in a swamp, and it didn't move at all. The figure in the white light gradually became clear. There was despair in the eyes of the purple-robed spiritual body. He suddenly turned to look at Su Li, and his eyes were full of killing intent. Junior, I am in such a situation today because of you. Give me your life. Su Li's scalp was numb, and she was about to step back, but a figure was faster than her. In the blink of an eye, the purple-robed spiritual body couldn't move. Su Li was stunned for a moment, and turned to look at the place where the white light condensed, but there was no figure. At the same time, a cold snort came from the mouth of the white figure. Openly murder practitioners who enter the Star Path test privately suppress the gift of the Star Path and increase the difficulty of the test by more than 2 realms. All kinds of crimes are outrageous. If I didn't come in person, I don't know how many talents you will continue to kill. I can't let you live. Go away. As soon as the voice fell, a white light poured into the spiritual body. The purple-robed spiritual body, who was stepped on, let out a chilling scream, and struggled and howled wildly. You can talk, the arbitration of natural soul. How is it possible? My luck can't be so bad. She is just in Zhuji realm. How can she reach the perfect natural soul? I can't accept it. As the last sentence was said, the white light had completely penetrated into the spiritual body, and a black flame was ignited. In the blink of an eye, the purple-robed spiritual body was burned into nothingness, leaving only ashes floating in the starry sky. At the same time, the purple flying sword fixed in front of Su Li's face also slowly dissipated, and the crisis faded. Su Li watched this scene quietly. Looking at the decisive white figure, she couldn't help thinking. What kind of place was the Star Path? When she came for the first time, she thought it was just a space generated by a cultivation realm. But the appearance of the Sueyu tactics and the laughter told her that it was not the case. Now, the arbitration of Star Path came at her summon. She felt that the white figure was a living person. When she was taking the test in this space, would there be someone outside watching her walk to the end step by step? All kinds of doubts emerged from the bottom of her heart. At this time, the white figure turned around. Su Li couldn't see his face clearly in the dense white light, but she still saw that he seemed to smile. Very good, Junior. When you pass the 3rd Star Path, you may have a chance to enter the Star Hall. Come on. This time, you have encountered unfair treatment in the Star Path. According to the rules of the Star Hall, I will not only give you all the benefits of the Star Path, but also give you some compensation. What do you want? Star Hall. Su Li looked at the white figure. What is the Star Hall? The white figure smiled. You will know it later. Now tell me, what kind of compensation do you want? Of course, if you want me to promote your cultivation to Yuanying realm immediately, don't think about it. Su Li thought silently for a moment, raised her head and asked, what is sword intent? The white figure looked at Su Li in surprise. Is this the compensation you want? Su Li nodded. The white figure laughed and shook his head. You really don't know how to do business. But since it is your request, I will show you my sword intent. How much you can comprehend depends on yourself. Then, the white figure didn't wait for Su Li's response. A white light shot out from his fingers, leaving a sword mark that was not deep on the stone step. This sword mark can exist for 3 days. Whether you can comprehend anything from it depends on yourself. To put it bluntly, the sword intent is nothing more than obsession. Remember it. Before the voice died away, the white figure dissipated. He came and went in a hurry, as if he had never appeared. Su Li squatted down and looked at the sword mark on the ground. She seemed to understand something and muttered to herself, obsession. At this moment, it seemed that something began to sprout in the depths of her heart. 3 days passed quickly, but Su Li seemed to be immersed in the sword mark. She was still staring at the stone step that had disappeared. She didn't know how long had passed. Finally, when her injuries were almost healed by self-healing, she finally woke up and stood up with a normal look. At this time, a mechanical voice sounded in the nothingness. "Do you accept the gift of the Chuangxing path now?" Su Li's eyes flashed. She looked at the 18th stone step with burning eyes and said lightly, "No need. After I pass the 18th step, you can pour all of it into me." On the 18th step, the picture changed. Su Li fell on the high platform and saw the middle-aged man opposite her. She raised the long sword and attacked without saying anything. She turned her wrist and the sword move was formed automatically. This move was not the 6th move, and there was no cyan light flashing on the sword. The first move of Tsuashing, collapse. Su Li spoke softly, and the black light flashed in her eyes again. For the first time, the sword was plated with a layer of black light that was very similar to the purple light. The puppet's dull face collided with the sword. Bang! It was like two wooden swords colliding together. Su Li was stunned. The opponent's attack was much weaker than she imagined, even weaker than the first step. "It shouldn't be. What a young man. You dare to test your sword on me here. Do you want to die?" At this time, the puppet's dull face became lively. He said with a smile, "I haven't seen such an interesting little guy for a long time. How about we practice?" You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.